Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. From where I am right now in Daegu, South Korea, to wherever you are in the world, welcome to Medieval Storytime with the Contessa. I am the Contessa. Some of you know me as the Creative Contessa, and some of you know me as Rachel. But either way, I'm welcoming you into my intimate chambers this morning, this afternoon, this evening for some fun story time. So I have picked a selection of very interesting texts for you today. In fact, I think I may have over chosen. Um, so we've got a text. I've extracted a dance manual from the 15th century so you can actually see how 15th century dance masters thought about their own art and also possibly how other people thought about the art of dance by contrast. Also, some dance instructions for what is actually a very popular dance in certain uh, reenactment and living history groups. Some of you may be familiar with the dance, and it might interest you to hear the actual instructions that we have for it so that you can understand exactly what it is we're working with when we're reconstructing historical dances. I've also got a fun recipe for you that I think I may have decided this might be included in our medieval cooking in the modern kitchen with the Contessa because it kind of all ties in with my desire to make zabaione. And then, because I recently had a very interesting comment in under one of my YouTube videos in reference to my neckline, actually, my décolleté, and that comment basically underscored the importance to dispel the idea of medieval prudishness. There is no prudishness in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. I mean, it's just not part of Western European society as a whole. What most people associate or consider to be prudishness is actually arises with the Reformation, and it's kind of the lack of prudishness, the sort of naturally lusty and licentious behavior of medieval people is in part what led to some of the movements within the Reformation, including and definitely not limited to the Puritans. So yeah, I picked a story out that will dispel any misconceptions about medieval prudes. Yeah, which means also that story is well, it is not what I would call graphically explicit, but it's naughty. It's naughty, shall we say. Good morning, Susan. Good morning, Takeda. Thank you for joining us again this morning. Well, us, I guess because I'm surrounded by cats, I now feel like I'm a plural. Thank you for joining me this morning. And just because I know it triggers certain people, I'm going to go ahead and put on my favorite Maria Portinari collar. It is very interesting what triggers people these days. Someone recently shared my little short excerpt of washing my hair in my pavilion at Pensick a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may remember I did a full live stream. This is so much easier if there's someone else to do this. I did a full live stream demonstrating my interpretation of 15th century hair washing. And I shared an excerpt of that, and someone actually got so offended by it that she posted it, shared it on her wall, and then exclaimed how disgusting it was that I was reliving the Middle Ages. And she was very happy with her modern hair care products, which meant her hair had no detritus in it. So, yeah, I've been very interested at what seems to trigger people. This collar triggers a lot of people because they say I shouldn't dare wear it with just my kirtle. But you know what? I'm a noblewoman in her private chambers, and I'm dressed casually for myself and my intimate companions, but I feel like dressing up my kirtle a little bit. So yes, I may be in my undergarments, but that doesn't mean that I don't like to add a little bit of bling to it. And there is no evidence. I challenge anyone to provide me with actual evidence that a noblewoman never would have worn her lovely collar like this in the intimacy of her private quarters. You can't prove a negative though. So yeah. And yeah, I get some people say, well, it's a specialty item that you only would have worn on special occasions. Well, I have the rank of countess in this medieval living history world in certain organizations. So that's pretty high ranking on the social ladder. And so for me, this is not necessarily just a specialty item that I wear just once a year. Anyway, yeah, now I'm triggered. Shampoo is poison. Yeah. Apparently, modern hair care products are the only thing that one should use and one should not. Apparently, this individual, I guess, had never heard of experimental archaeology. She definitely shouldn't watch the show Tudor Monastery Farm or Green Tales from the Green Valley. She shouldn't go to certain living history villages across Europe where people literally live there medievally for the whole summer, avoiding the use of modern products except where absolutely necessary. She'd be pretty horrified, I guess. But yeah. Sean, now you're triggered. Okay, so I'm trying to decide what to start with. I think we're going to go ahead and start with some of the cooking texts. So just to present where I am extract the sources for today's text in terms of sources that are accessible to you versus, say, a manuscript on the British Library's digitized manuscript collection. Which, by the way, the British Library, they were hacked a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you heard about that. And their massive collection of digitized manuscripts was destroyed. Thankfully, the manuscripts weren't. The digitized files were. Thankfully, they have been slowly, God bless them, redigitizing these manuscripts and re-uploading them. So if you want to check out, the British Library's amazing digital manuscript collection. They certainly have not finished getting through all of their extensive archives, but they are slowly, bit by bit, restoring it. Yeah. Okay, so first text from which we're going to be reading, and this is one of my frequent recommendations in my book corner. Everyone a Witness, The Plantagenet Age, right? This is available on Abe Books. It gets deshelved from libraries. The copy I have was, in fact, from the Medieval Studies Library, wherever that happened to be. That was probably at a university. No, sorry. Property of Charles A. Owen Jr. in his Medieval Studies Library. Property of Charles A. Owen Jr. Medieval Studies Library. Probably could look that up and figure out if that's actually part of a history department at some university. Anyway, Everyone a Witness, The Plantagenet Age is a fantastic collection of texts, chronicles, recipes, diatribes, court cases from across the Plantagenet age, so end of the 12th century through to the end of the 15th century. And it's broken down by topic. So, for instance, family, towns and buildings, food and drink, crime and punishment, warfare, famous people, religion, and health. And then you can actually just read through and get a much fuller idea about not just the lives of the nobility, but the lives of the daily people, because this book really seeks to make sure that sort of as many classes of society, as many branches and strata of society are covered. And they succeed pretty well. So, yeah. So as always, the format is going to be, once I start reading, once I read a text, we're going to go text by text. So I will completely read the entirety of the one selection. Then I will answer questions and I will go back through and we will discuss the text bit by bit. I will explain where I can, elucidate, provide more context, provide more examples, etc. So let me just go and check the comments before I get to that. Let's see. I'm sure there were people who loved the feel of jewels or gold or whatever. And if you paid for it, why not wear it as you wish to? Yes, exactly. Thank you, Takeda. So this is a replica of Maria. I know everyone's going to ask. So I'll state for the first time now, this is a replica of the collar that belonged to Maria Portinari. It's depicted in two different portraits of hers. Her portrait from when she was freshly betrothed and not yet married to Tommaso Portinari. And then about 10, 12 years later, in the Van der Goes altarpiece that is in the Uffizi, depicting her in one wing and her husband in the other, and a bunch of saints and whatnot in the middle. Right, so this is a replica by Armor and Castings. And if you like this, you can absolutely purchase one for yourself. It is not inexpensive. It's pretty solid and it's pretty heavy. But yeah, Armor and Castings for the win. Who would hack into a library to burn books? So many people. Richard, welcome. Thank you for joining us again today. Right. So to whet your appetite and prepare you for what is to come in the cooking the cooking medievally in a modern kitchen with the Contessa, I found, these are recipes, pretty much all of them, ironically or interestingly, not curiously, fascinatingly, because actually, if I think about it, it isn't curious. Almost all of the recipes that are contained in the Plantagenet Age, Everyone a Witness, I have read them. I have the actual cookbooks. Well, I have the printed and transcribed and printed versions of the actual cookbook. So I have actually read all of these recipes in other sources. But it is nice to have a kind of a collection, a compilation like this, where you don't have to look in 20 different books to learn about 20 different subjects. You can look in one book and learn about 20 different subjects of daily life in the Middle Ages. So, yeah. Okay, so as again, just to repeat, I will read through completely this recipe in this case, and then we will go back through and discuss it together, and I will explain some of the things that it actually mentions. Okay, so this is actually from a 15th century manuscript that is contained in the British Museum. It's contained in what's, you're going to hear the Harleian manuscript. There are a lot of Harleian manuscripts though. So for instance, one of the finger loop braiding manuals from the 15th century is a Harleian manuscript. So I know that doesn't narrow it down, but that's its attribution. So this is a recipe that has been compiled also in another book called Two 15th Century Cookery Books. I can recommend it if you can get it. Of course, as always, anytime you have a book that's edited or annotated or interpreted, there's going to be some other interpretive actions that get involved into the sort of the editorial process of the book, but at least the original recipes were also included. Right, so the recipe. Larded milk. Take milk, scalding hot, and take eggs, the yolks and the white, and draw them through a strainer and cast them into the milk. And then draw the juice of herbs, whichever thou wilt, so that they be good, and draw them through a strainer. And when the milk beginneth to curdle, cast the juice thereto, if thou wilt have it green. And if thou wilt have it red, take saunders, and cast to the milk when it curdleth, and leave the herbs. And if thou wilt have it yellow, take saffron, and cast it to the milk when it curdleth, and then leave off the saunders. And if thou wilt have it of all of these colors, take a pot with milk and juice of herbs, another pot with milk and saffron, and another pot with milk and saunders, and put them all in a linen cloth and press them all together. And if thou wilt have it of one color, take but one cloth, and strain it in a cloth in the same manner. And beat on the cloth with a ladle or a skimmer to make it solid and flat. Slice it fair with a knife, and fry the slices in a pan with a little fresh grease. And take a little and put it in a dish and mess it forth. Okay, so first off, okay, so larded milk is the recipe. So first I'll go take a look at the comments. Odele, welcome. This is Medieval Storytime with the Contessa. Today's first story, I suppose, if we want to refer to that, is the story of a medieval dish, of a 15th century dish called larded milk, and how to make it. So first off is the title, Larded Milk. So larding, the word lard, of course, has a very specific modern connotation, which is to say rendered pork fat. In fact, I think the word lard modernly only refers to pork fat. Tallow refers to large ruminants of a red meat nature, right? But I haven't actually verified that lard, in fact, these days is uniquely applied to porcine, to the rendered fat of porcine, of members of the porcine family. Yeah. So we're going to go through the recipe. Sean, fear not. We are now going to go through the recipe. So larded in this case actually is a synonym for curdled, but it's curdled in the sense of you have fat added, more fat added to it. But the process is very interesting. So there's a bit of kitchen science here, and I love kitchen science. I love using heat and cold and acid and base to wreak what I call kitchen magic, right? Is to transform the nature of items, kitchen culinary alchemy, shall we call it. So the first thing is to take milk scalding hot. So this should tell you how much is left out of a medieval recipe. If you look at a modern recipe, especially a very thorough recipe, say by a cooking school or a cooking association organization like America's Test Kitchen, their recipes are extremely detailed. They leave there's very little that is assumed. Very little knowledge is assumed in an America's Test Kitchen recipe, right? But at the very beginning of this recipe, we already start part of the way into it, namely that the milk already needs to be scalding hot. So the first thing you obviously need to do is actually bring the milk up to, but not quite to, the boiling point. So that would be scalding, right? So it's very, very hot, but it's not actually at the point where it's boiling. And there's a reason for that. Have any of you accidentally boiled milk, just plain milk? And did you notice that the milk boils generally well over the pot and all over the stove? Well, that's because of a difference between the surface tension of the milk and the steam bubbles being created by the milk reaching boiling. The surface tension of the milk doesn't break quickly enough for the bubbles to escape. And so it literally pushes itself out of the pan because the bubbles can't escape. So it literally pushes itself out of the pan, and then the surface breaks once it explodes over the edge. And that's why it will then stop boiling, right? Which is why there are tricks to prevent your milk from boiling over. One of them is to actually put a wooden spoon and just leave the wooden spoon in the pot while the milk heats up, because that wooden spoon breaks the surface tension right there in the area around the spoon, and then the steam can escape and then it won't boil over. The other thing is that it will only boil to a certain point. So if you have, I think the ratio is 1 to 4. So if you have a cup of milk that you need to boil, that you want to heat up, then make sure that your pot is at least 4 cups deep, and then it won't actually overboil. So yeah. But that means that this milk should be scalding hot, very hot, but short of boiling. Yeah. Yeah. Until a skin formed. Yep. No, it's not. So actually, yes. So it does make a kind of curd. It makes curds. This makes curds. 100% this makes curds. And it might sound nasty, but I promise it's going to be delicious. I promise. Just hear me out. Okay, so we take milk that starts off scalding hot. So we already have to have brought it up to that point just before, exactly, Richard, when depending on your milk. I actually I don't know if the skin forms on raw, unhomogenized milk. I say I don't know because I haven't been able to get raw unhomogenized milk and experiment with it, unfortunately. Yeah, Faye, thank you for that compliment. Maria Portinari's collar, you can get this from Armor and Castings if you want one. Contessa 10 gets you 10% off. They are free information. I mean, I've complete honest disclosure. Armor and Castings are one of my channel sponsors. Okay, so we start with our scalding hot milk, and then it says, and take eggs and the yolks and the white and draw them through a strainer. So what you will notice when you start reading medieval recipes en masse is that there are no whisks. They never mention a whisk, ever. They often don't even mention mixing like we would think to mix. They nearly always use a strainer for incorporating one substance into another in a very fine manner, rather than whisking it, because it actually says take basically whole eggs, the yolks and the white, and that's unusual. Most medieval recipes discard the white. They use the yolk, they don't use the white. So this is very interesting that it's not many, like 70% of recipes discard the white and use only the yolk. And they've got other uses for the white, but a lot kitchen uses too. Actually, I'll talk about that after the recipe. If you want me to tell you some of the medieval uses for egg whites after we get through the recipe, remind me. Okay. So we take basically our whole eggs, the yolk and the white, and we draw it through a strainer. So a medieval strainer is not much different than the strainer you would have now, except that the ones I've seen have wooden sides and a mesh screen, and they're flat, they're not curved. So you would actually crack the egg onto the strainer and draw it through as maybe the image it conjures as you pulling the egg through with your hands. That's not how it works. You can take a spoon and kind of smush it into the strainer by rubbing the spoon back and forth. You could also just take your fingers and press it through the strainer. right? A lot of serious serious hobby cooks like me, I use my fingers for a lot of things that most people wouldn't in the kitchen, right? In fact, that's my preferred method of separating the egg from the white, is just to use my fingers to strain out the white and capture the yolk. And so honestly, that is for me, that gets the most white away from the most yolk. Yeah. So yeah, put your yolk and white through the strainer. And so that's obviously supposed to mix it, but it doesn't say whether it says through the strainer. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it should only be once. See, there's a lot of assumed knowledge here, right? Like, you should know how strained, how mixed that egg should be. Oh, there's another reason you might want to put it through a strainer. Can anyone guess why you might want to put a fresh egg from chickens that are definitely free range, and a rooster that is definitely free range, that definitely has free access to hens? Why might you want to put your egg through that strainer? Can anyone guess? Yeah. So the reality is that eggs in this era were probably more often than not fertilized, which means that when you crack that egg open, and I mean, you can tell, you can shake an egg, and you can feel the difference between an egg that has a pretty large embryo in it and an egg that doesn't. But even just, a little chunky bit of embryo, you're not going to want in this recipe, as you're going to find out. So you'd be able to strain out, any fertilized embryos. But also, yeah, if the shell breaks, for instance, the strainer gets the shell out. So, not only the strainer can perform two different functions, it can strain out literally unwanted bits, but it will also break the egg up into a more homogeneous mixture. But it doesn't say anything about it having to be mixed well. And these recipes often do say, if they want it to be mixed well, they will tell you mixed well, often, but not always, right? That's the benefit of reading lots and lots of medieval recipes, for instance, is you get an idea over time about the concepts that can be described if they are necessary, or will be described if they're necessary, versus things that generally always seem to be taken for granted. So we've got our scalding hot milk, we've got our eggs, and it just says, here's the other part: take milk scalding hot and eggs. What what very important and crucial piece of information seems to be missing there if you were to do this as a modern recipe? I will repeat: take milk scalding hot and take eggs. What's the very, very key, like almost most fundamental thing in any modern recipe that allows you to reliably reproduce the recipe multiple times? Does anyone guess? Yeah, exactly. It's the measurements. How much milk? How many eggs? We know it's more than one because eggs is in the plural. We don't know how much milk, though. Isn't that fun? Yeah. Welcome to reading this recipe and noting all of these discrepancies or deficiencies will then naturally lead on to the experimental archaeology phase, where we see what happens. Do I have a 15th century strainer? I do. I have something that's probably conjecturally close to being a 15th century strainer. They they still make them in Korea. Basically, it's got a round wooden ring, and it's got a relatively fine metal mesh in the middle of it. So yeah. Well, when to put the eggs and the milk together, we get there. But before that, we don't even know how much milk or how many eggs, right? We just know more than one egg. And of course, we're going to assume it's a chicken egg because it doesn't say otherwise, right? Chicken egg could be a goose egg, could be a duck egg. They have all of those things plentifully in most of medieval Europe, right? But we're just going to assume a chicken egg, and it's more than one. So we take our scalding hot milk of some random quantity, our eggs, more than one, but who knows how many, whole eggs, yolk and the white. We draw it through a strainer, and then we cast it to the milk, it says. So we add the yolks and the white after they go through the strainer to the milk. Now this milk is scalding hot. It is scalding hot. Eggs have a very low temperature at which the proteins in eggs will coagulate, right? It doesn't take much heat to make an egg coagulate, the proteins in egg to coagulate, to cook, basically, right? So, yeah, that's probably going to result relatively instantly in cooked egg, which is interesting. But maybe not. We'd have to check it out because it also says take scalding hot milk. So the milk should still be scalding hot. So it's not a question of bringing the milk to a certain temperature and then letting it cool. It should still be hot. So this eggs go through the strainer and then into the milk. So this is not like a custard, right? This is not a custard like many of you would think, where you want the eggs to be mixed in thoroughly and evenly, right? And so that you create this smooth, silky thing. That is zabaglione, and there's a recipe for that. And that's why I think I'm going to do that in combination with the larded milk recipe. Then it says, so you've got the scalding hot milk mixed with these eggs that have been put through a strainer to be both sieve strained and also to be mixed to some degree, right? It says, and then draw the juice of herbs, whichever thou wilt. So any herbs that you want, so that they be good, and draw them through a strainer. So yeah, whichever herbs, right? Just any herbs. And we find out in the next sentence that they should be green. They should be green herbs, whichever thou wilt. So you would have to, this could well be based on what's in season, because you want fresh herbs. Dried herbs, there will be no juice. There will be no juice from dried herbs. Yes, you could try to rehydrate the herbs, but the green that you get from rehydrated herbs is no, not much. Not much green from rehydrated herbs, if any, depending on the herb. So it's going to be whatever is in season or is local to you, because it needs to be fresh. So you draw the juice of herbs, and it doesn't say how to draw the juice of the herbs. So you have to figure out what that process might be. And whichever thou wilt, so that they be good, is meaning just as long as they are good herbs, right? So that doesn't mean that you're getting the juice out and then that makes it good. So that they be good means just as long as the herbs are good herbs. So I think what they're saying is, please don't use pennyroyal here. And draw them, although they did use pennyroyal in recipes sometimes. Yeah. Their definition of good is maybe not my definition of good. And then it says, and draw them through a strainer. Right. So again, we're using this strainer. The strainer really is the food processor of the Middle Ages. It really is. So you've got these herbs, and it says to draw the juice of the herbs and then draw them through the strainer. So obviously, this set of instructions might seem kind of confusing, but I think it's supposed to be taken as a whole. That pushing the herbs through the strainer into the strainer is a way to get the juice out of them, right? And then it says, and when the milk beginneth to curdle, cast the juice thereto if thou wilt have it green, right? So there is an acknowledgement here that there is going to be a curdling process that will be the result of the eggs having been added to the scalding hot milk and the milk being scalding hot. And that as soon as it starts to curdle, that's when you should cast the juice there too. So what's interesting is this recipe seems to imply, anyway, that there's a delay, some kind of delay between the yolk, the eggs, the strained eggs being cast into the milk and the curdling process happening. It seems to imply that there should be enough time for you to get the juice out of your herbs. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true, which is why medieval recipes sometimes read a bit like stream of conscience. Stream of conscience. So, it feels like the cook is like writing down how they do the recipe, and they're writing, and like, oh crap. And then you have to have this. Oh, wait. And now we go back to that step. Right. So sometimes these recipes read this way. So sometimes you can't actually necessarily take the recipe entirely as a timeline. Sometimes with the experimentation, you might find that certain things need to be done in a different order for it to actually work. For instance, you might find that you need to have your juice of herbs already prepared, because the instructions say that when the milk beginneth to curdle, so not after it curdles, but right at the inception of the curdling process. And I think that's because you want the juice of the herbs to incorporate into the curds fully, and so that it's entirely green. Okay, so let's go through and see what the the quantities are. Okay, right. Melissa, thank you. Welcome. This is Maria Portinari's collar. It's from her. She has two portraits, a betrothal portrait and an amazing altarpiece in the Uffizi. So it's referred to as a collar in 15th century English, actually. Yeah, Maria Portinari by Armor and Castings. How did they measure quantity? So, Richard, they actually did have quantity measures. So it's really funny that they almost never include them in these recipes, but they did have them. They had volumetric measurements and they had scales. They did have scales in the Middle Ages. From all the way from goldsmith, very, very finely honed scales, all the way up to giant scales for measuring goods coming off of merchant ships so that they can collect tolls on them. So they had both volumetric measures and weight-based measures. The volumetric measures are a little opaque though, because they can sometimes, and they don't always align at all with even their modern equivalent. So a 15th century English court might not be what you think of as a court, for instance. If anyone is familiar with the Society for Creative Anachronism and their amazing publications, The Complete Anachronist, back in the mid 90s, some wonderful soul did something that went beyond PhD level dissertation research into medieval weights and measures and published a two volume work on medieval weights and measures for different polities all across Europe, and breaking them down and explaining probably what they are in modern terms. So if you're interested in medieval weights and measures, go to the Society for Creative Anachronism's website, check out their complete anachronist, and look for the one on weights and measures. And they're not expensive at all. Takeda, a friend, do a cooking class for period strainers, got some natural fiber buckram and inexpensive embroidery hoops to make strainers for the class. Oh, that's brilliant, Takeda. That's a great suggestion. Okay, yeah. So if you want to make your own, if you want to make your own medieval strainer, although with the buckram, it might not be stiff enough for some of the food processing purposes. It's very likely that some of the food strainers were often, the screens were actually wire, because they could make very fine wire in the Middle Ages. But get an embroidery hoop, get some kind of stiff fabric with a relatively loose weave, like buckram, for instance, or some kind of canvas. Cheesecloth might actually not be stiff enough, but something along those lines. Horsehair canvas might actually work really well now that I think about it. And then you can make your own strainer. That's a brilliant idea. Takeda says, I would guess drawing the juice of herbs would involve a mortar and pestle. Yeah, absolutely could. Actually, you're right. Now that I think about it. Yeah. So if you grind, but you're right. So if you grind your herbs in a mortar and pestle, and that will give you a pretty juicy, sloshy, what's the word? Slurry. That's what I'm looking for. It would give you a pretty juicy slurry, right? But then you'll have all those chunks, you're right. And then you press that through the strainer and then you get your juice out. Yep, agree 100%, Takeda. Can you recommend a medieval dish with flavors that I wouldn't find in modern food? All most medieval dishes have flavors you wouldn't find in modern food, at least modern Western food, because medieval cuisine is generally filled, and in fact, this one is going to have some flavors that you're not going to recognize. We'll get there in a minute. But Sean, if you want to kind of dive right in, basically any medieval pottage, which is a kind of stew, is going to have spices and it's going to have vinegar, and that spices like cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg and grains of paradise, and that would be completely foreign to you unless you eat that way normally. Oh, Melissa, thank you. Super generous of you. Wow, appreciate that super chat. How prevalent was chefs preparing foreign dishes for their diners? Would the Duchess of York's chef prepare an Italian dish or a Milanese dish? Yeah, so actually, many of the English compilations of recipes from the 14th and 15th century heavily feature French recipes that appear in French cooking manuals from the era, and also some Italian ones. For example, lozenges is the English corruption of the word lasagna. So there was definitely, especially at the upper echelons of society, there was absolutely an international understanding of cuisine. And it seems that a lot of the very very sophisticated recipes that you find in English collections, many of them seem to be French in the 15th century. Yeah. So that's a great question, Susan. And Italian recipes are also making their way, but interestingly, I'm thinking about this. I don't know if I've seen like ravioli recipes, for instance, in any of the 15th century French or English collections. I'd have to go and examine them from a different perspective. But there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of some of the sauces seem to be very international. Carmeline sauce, for instance, is very international. Certain kinds of meat and egg pies just seem to crop up everywhere. Blancmange, which is rice with almond milk and chicken, and usually some cinnamon or something, is also prevalent all over Europe. So, yeah. Good question, Susan. Okay. So, let me see. When the milk beginneth to curdle, cast the juice thereto, if thou wilt have it green. So not only though will that juice make it green, it will also give it the flavor of the herbs. So it is a natural dye stuff, but it is also a flavor giver, which would probably be very different from what we might expect in, say, our scrambled eggs these days, even though this isn't scrambled eggs. And then it says, if thou wilt have it red, take Saunders, which is horse parsley, by the way, and cast it to the milk when it curdleth. Saunders is toxic in large enough quantities. So that's interesting. But it is Saunders. Saunders is a common red dye stuff in medieval cuisine. So yeah. Yeah, so but there are other ways that you could turn your curd red without possibly harming your health. I mean, the amount of Saunders that they're using here is not going to be enough to poison you, at least not in one go. But still. But it does say, if thou wilt have it red, take Saunders and cast it to the milk when it curdleth, and leave off the herbs. So they're actually specifying that this isn't in addition to, you don't put in the juice of the herbs and then the Saunders. It's either the herbs, the herb juice, or the Saunders. But again, no idea about quantity. Just the juice of herbs, whichever thou wilt, just red Saunders, horse parsley, however much, right? We don't know. Again, there's a lot of assumed knowledge here. So, these dishes were probably so ubiquitous in the courts, especially amongst the well-heeled, the aristocrats, the wealthy merchants, that they just knew kind of instinctively at least the basic ratios, right? They understood that you're not going to take a pound of green herbs to, your pottle of I'm going to just give it a measurement, your pottle of scalding hot milk and your 2 eggs or whatever the quantities actually were. So, because they would have known the dish. This isn't like an innovative dish. It's not new. This is a dish that was already common and it's just being documented here. So the people who may have had access to such a collection of recipes would have known basically how it's supposed to turn out. And they would probably instinctively therefore known how much you needed to add of each thing in order for it to be successful, right? That's the difference between following a recipe and being able to cook. Right. Being actually able to cook, like being a cook, means that you understand the foundational techniques and science and base level recipes so that you can then combine those without a recipe into other dishes, or that you can use that foundational level of knowledge to interpret more sophisticated recipes. Like most anyone can just follow a recipe, but actually but on their, maybe even with guidance, but actually understanding the culinary techniques on your own. That's what differentiates someone who's just cooking from a cook or a chef even. Yeah, so we've got the Saunders, and then if thou wilt have it yellow, take saffron and cast it to the milk when it curdleth, and leave off the Saunders. So saffron, of course, in this era is an expensive herb. I have a video on my YouTube channel about saffron if you're interested. It's only 12 minutes long. And in essence, it at certain points in history, it has had the equivalent value by weight to gold. I'm not exaggerating. Someone tried to take me to task for that, but it's true. At various points in history, saffron and gold, pound for pound, have had the same value. Okay, going to the comments. Okay, today we use pink Himalayan salt. Back in the 15th century, did they only use bleach white salt? No, that's a good question, Richard. There were a variety of salts in the 15th century, and from everything from salt that was purely utilitarian, made from the evaporated water from brackish marsh water, right? And that was kind of a gray salt, and that was not considered a pretty salt. And some cookbooks actually have recipes, instructions for how to make your salt white, because it was desirable that it should be white. No, but then they had salt from mines. They had salt from evaporation fields on the seashore. So it would depend on the mine. Now, did they have pink Himalayan salt? I don't think so. I don't, I haven't seen evidence of Himalayan salt being imported. As far as I know, that the salt mines to which they had access, most of which were in Germany, I think, or Central Europe. I'm pretty certain that salt is white or can be turned white. Yeah. But they definitely had sea salt. They had sea salt and they had mined salt. And technically mined salt is the remnants of an old ocean, but if these dishes were so ubiquitous, then why record them? Pancakes are ubiquitous, and yet people write recipes down for those. But I mean, it's a good question. So one of the reasons that that people recorded recipes in a pre-printing press era, when books were expensive, it was often a way of for certain cooks, it could be a way of a resume, right? Like they would actually put together certain cooks, like Master Schirkar, who wrote down his great compilation in 1406. He actually was basically, putting together his resume and saying, look, I know all of these recipes. I can cook all of these things. And here's how I believe you should organize a kitchen. And here's how you should supply the kitchen. So you should hire me for your affair, or as your head cook, your master chef, your head of your kitchens, because I can do all of this for you, right? And this is the same thing for dances, right? A lot of the dances were ubiquitous and highly practiced, and yet still they wrote them down. But you'll notice they never write them down in a way that's really useful in terms of really truly reproducing it. So much is left out. So yeah, often these recipe collections are part of a sort of, this is my masterpiece, this is my masterwork from the chefs themselves. In some cases, they come out of books of secrets. So a book of secrets, a lady of the house would basically have her own private collection of recipes for both food and cosmetics and skincare and medicine and tips and tricks for household management. And even though some of these recipes are relatively ubiquitous, maybe she encountered something new. It's just because pancakes are ubiquitous doesn't mean that someone from Italy knows what American style pancakes are. Doesn't mean that someone from America knows what uh, Breton style galettes are, right? So it's a kind of crate made from delicious, yummy buckwheat. So yeah, ubiquitous means that they're pretty prevalent, but of course there's still going to be some people who don't necessarily know them. I would say that one of the things about European medieval cooking, at least court cooking, that is such a difference from today's taste, is that today we showcase a taste. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, back then they wanted all the flavors, provided the culmination was pleasant to them. Yeah, I agree with that, Takeda. Yeah, instead of this is cinnamon flavored. No, no, no. This is spiced sweetly. Absolutely. Absolutely, Takeda. 100%. Yep. Okay. So we have our scalding hot milk. We've strained several whole eggs into it. We have cast thereto. We've drawn the juice of herbs, and we've cast thereto, or we've cast thereto red saunders, and it doesn't even say how to prepare the saunders. Like maybe it should also be prepared in the same way as the juice of the herbs. Maybe it should be put in a mortar and pestle and then put through a strainer. We don't know. Take saffron and cast it into the milk. Now, yeah, you could cast whole strands of saffron into the milk, but it would be way better if you ground them in a mortar, decocted them in some milk of their own, and then added it, right? So, it might not be as simple as this recipe actually says. There might be several processing stages that are being left out because they are being taken for granted. And then it says, and if thou wilt have all of these colors, take a pot with milk and juice of herbs, and another pot with milk and saffron, and another pot with milk and saunders. Right? So basically, it's saying that you need to prepare 3 separate pots with scalding hot milk, and in each of them put one of your separate colorants. And all of those colorants are all going to give it flavor. Like the saunders is going to give a flavor, the saffron is definitely going to give a flavor, the juice of herbs is going to give a flavor. And then put them all in a linen cloth and strain them. Now, that's a very interesting detail because there are certainly multiple types of very practical workhorse cloths, in the 15th century kitchen at 15th century disposal, right? But they specify linen cloth. And that's because the linen, and I use linen also for when I make cheese, when I make cream cheese, when I make uh, paneer, any kind of fresh cheese, I also use linen. Works a charm, right? So you put it in linen and you press them all together. How many of you have made cheese? Have you made cheese? Have you made paneer? This is the exact same process that I use for making paneer. Literally, I put it in a cloth, I strain it, and then I press it all together into a cake, right? And sometimes I do that manually, but this recipe actually stipulates violence. It actually says, and beat on the cloth with a label or a skimmer to make it solid and flat. And skimmers in this area are they're a long handle and they're with a round, flattish end that has lots of little holes in it because it's used for skimming scum off of pots and other things. But it would make a pretty good tool for beating the crap out of your curds, right? And beat on the cloth with a ladle or skimmer to make it solid and flat. So this is a way to convince it to be one solid block. Yeah. Yeah. Cheese is super easy to make. It really is. Yeah. Cheese is easy to make. What gets complicated is when you want to get into like the multi-layer cheeses that have different suites of bacteria, different layers and that kind of thing. But at its core, base cheese is not hard. Yeah. I haven't made cheese, but love eating it. So we now have our curds, which, this is going to be a combination of, this hypothetically, it's a combination of the eggs and the milk to some degree. And I haven't made this yet. So I'll be very interested to experiment on this with you all, perhaps live, and see what actually comes out of it. Right. So we've got this brick, basically, this patty, this cake of the curdled milk and eggs. And then it says slice it fair with a knife. And this is my favorite part. Fry the slices in a pan with a little fresh grease. Take a little and put it in a dish and mess it forth. Mess means to serve. Serve it forth. Yeah. So this is basically a kind of fried fresh cheese, right? So imagine halloumi, right? It's not the same in the terms of the components because halloumi doesn't have, as far as I know, it doesn't have eggs added to it, but it's the same idea, right? This is a medieval recipe for fried cheese. How awesome is that? And you can make it pretty colors with slight flavorings. And it does, you don't even, if you read closely, you don't even have to add any of those colors because it says, and when the milk beginneth to curdle, cast the juice thereto, if thou wilt have it green. So hypothetically, you don't have to add any of these colors. You could not poison it with Saunders or not make it more nutritious with saffron and or herbs, right? So this fresh grease, a little fresh grease. Okay, so what is a little? Again, what are we talking about? Shallow frying, deep frying. It says a little fresh grease. So at most it's shallow frying. But I really think what they want here is they just want it to not stick to the pan. And that term fresh grease, it's not oil. So this is not olive oil or something like that. This is probably lard or tallow. Could be duck fat, but probably lard or tallow. Lard is the rendered fat of a pig. Tallow is the rendered fat of a cow. And then you put it in a dish and serve it forth. Okay, questions. So do the eggs turn into scrambled eggs when you pour them into the hot milk? Yeah, so that is an interesting question, Sean, and one I'm going to have to answer by trying this. So if the scalding milk is the right temperature, it could well be that the eggs do not instantly turn into scrambled eggs in the milk, and that there's some kind of chemical reaction and or temperature-based reaction between the eggs and the milk that allows them to form one kind of, as you point it, do they combine a combined cohesive mass that produces curds. So it's curds therefore consist of both the milk solids and the eggs all together, instead of some parts of the solids being milk curds and some part being the eggs. So We're gonna have to find out together because I haven't actually made this recipe. I've read it multiple times. I haven't actually made it, but I really want to make it now. And I want to make it, I want to do this together. And then I want in the same session, I think I want to do zabaglione, which if I'd been smart about, I would have found the recipe, which is an actual wine egg custard that is super yummy. But it's got the similar kind of science idea of, in this case, we're curdling, but in that case, we're thickening. So yeah, that's why I wanted to do them together. Also because they're not terribly involved recipes. Either of them don't take very long. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so that is larded milk, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, any questions about our larded milk? While I let you ask your questions, I will mention the etymology of the word larder. Right. So the word larder is the 15th century and a historical earlier English word for a cool room, the place where you actually kept things cool. It was usually below ground, so it maintained a lower temperature. In some larders, they did actually bring down barrels of ice from the mountains, snow from the mountains to help chill them. But usually it was just the virtue of it being below ground, a cellar basically that kept it cooler. It's called the larder because they used to cover the meat in lard to help preserve it. So you'd mummify it. You'd entomb your meat in a protective layer of fat of lard, and then you would keep it in the larder because you larded it in the larder, and the temperature would allow it to age slowly and not rot. Right. Okay. I love your lives and clothes. I wish there were more channels like this that have actual information and are truly interesting. Viking CFO, I really appreciate that. Thank you for being part of my community, or as I'm increasingly calling it, thank you for being part of my court. Really appreciate that. Can mint be added to the zabaglione? You could, but I wouldn't. The wine, zabaglione in the case of the medieval recipe is wine flavored. I wouldn't want mint and wine. I don't think that would be a great combination. I think that would be frankly terrible. But you could. There's no reason you couldn't. I wonder if the use of casting in the translation is specific and not general to combine. I wonder if they mean to temper it. Yeah. So what I wanted to do actually was go back and find the original English recipe. And this shows how much I don't love you all because apparently I forgot to do that. I meant to go back and find the English because it's English. It's written in English, 15th century English. I wanted to go find the original 15th century English recipe. I'm going to try to do that for next week. Because I'll read it to you in late Middle English, early modern English pronunciation so you can actually hear it. But yeah, what am I always saying about translations? I hate translations done by other people. So yeah, I wanted to go back and actually look at that and get the original language. But cast, I will say that the word cast is like the most common translation for that set of instructions in all the English sources. I can say that for certain. That's why I want to get back to the original language, because especially now in combination with the University of Michigan's fantastic online Middle English dictionary, I can really get into the nitty gritty of the actual meaning in the original language. Yeah. Okay. Comment on larding and larders. Richard says, hence why corned beef is tinned in the lard. Exactly, to keep it fresh. Fat is a fantastic barrier against microbes. And that's why if you get a cut and you put something like lard or tallow on it, I know everyone wants to put petroleum on it, and that's okay. It's going to also create a barrier, but do you really want petrochemicals getting into your skin that way? Instead, lard or tallow, and it will actually help keep the microbes out. I mean, as long as your beef or tallow or your lard or tallow has been properly rendered and obviously doesn't have, yeah, then it should be fine. Okay, any other questions about larded milk? Yeah, I think I've settled. It's going to be larded milk and zabaglione for our upcoming cooking with the Contessa, medieval cooking with the Contessa in a modern kitchen. Medieval cooking in a modern kitchen with the Contessa. I think that's what I'm going to call that series. Yep. Okay. So I also wanted to, while we're on the topic of kitchens, right here in our, just so you know, right at this moment, we are reading from Everyone a Witness, The Plantagenet Age. Fantastic collection, highly recommend it. It's available on A-Books and lots of other used book sites. Don't buy it from Amazon, please. Just don't support Jeff Bezos. Yeah. No, Takeda, you're not. No, 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 Takeda, you're absolutely right, and thank you for calling me on that. So that I should go back and look at the original recipe. I completely appreciate that. Yeah, completely appreciate that. Okay, so on the subject of kitchens, often we wonder about the equipment that goes into a kitchen, right? And, we have depictions, but the depictions, especially before the 16th century, 16th century depictions of kitchens are great because, like, almost every single piece of equipment that is in a kitchen is depicted in any kitchen depiction. But before that, the depictions of kitchen equipment and kitchen outfitting, furnishings, etc., can be more limited or is often much, much, much more limited. But that's when we turn away from the iconography and we turn to the documentary evidence. And thankfully, we have a lot of excellent documentary evidence of how a medieval kitchen, in this case specifically a 15th century English kitchen, would have been equipped. And there is a letter, one of the Paston letters, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pastons. If you're interested in daily life for an up and coming family in 15th century England, look up the Paston letters. They have in the past, the letters have in the past been one of my very recommended readings. This is an excerpt from one of the Paston letters. It dates to about 1430, and this specific section of the letter itemizes the kitchen goods in the house of Sir John Falstolf. Falstolf. So Sir John Falstolf is he's gentry, he's minor gentry, right? So he's got a decent income, he lives comfortably. And so this is what his kitchen contains: one great brass pot, six coarse brass pots, three cupboards, one frying pan, four little brass pots, four great brass pots, three brass pike pans, two ladles and two skimmers of brass, one cauldron, one dietine pan of brass, one droppings pan, one gridiron, four rakes, three trivets, one dressing knife, one fire shovel, two trays, two great square spits, two square spits, one brass sieve, one brass mortar and one pestle, one grate, one wooden sieve or colander, one flesh hook, two pot hooks, one pair of tongs, one strainer, and one vinegar bottle. Yeah. The Shakespeare model for Falstaff. No, but the name is similar. Yeah, so some very interesting kitchen items there that you might not have realized existed in a medieval kitchen. Okay, so going back to the question, larded milk is definitely a new concept for me too. Yeah, yeah, it sounds so tasty. Now I want some. Will your condottiero be the taster for the cooking vlogs? Not for the subway. He's not back yet. So no, I will be the taster for the first cooking vlog anyway. But for the later ones, absolutely. He loves being my taster. Right. Okay. So there's some very fascinating pieces of equipment there. But the first thing to which I would like to draw your attention is the prevalence of brass as a material in this kitchen. So this is, again, he is a knight of some type or another. So he is gentry, and he has some kind of regular income, hence why his kitchen is pretty damned well equipped. And also, you'll notice that there's no mention of any ceramic pots, right? It's all brass pots. Now, there is a frying pan that is mentioned, and its metal is not named or its material is not named. So that frying pan could well be a ceramic frying pan. Ceramic frying pans are very prevalent in the archaeological record from the 15th century. I've had two of them. I shattered the first one in one of my very earliest medieval cooking experiments on over a fire, where I didn't think about the thermal shock that would result from taking the hot skillet and putting it on the cold ground, and it was very sad. It was very, very sad. But that frying pan was it was a ceramic frying pan, and it was glazed, and it was fantastic. The glaze was really, really fantastic. Loved it. So he has one great brass pot and six coarse brass pots. And I have to confess, I am not certain what coarse means in the context of brass pots. It could mean the metal is not as finely wrought as in the great brass pot. I'm honestly not certain. If you have an idea about why it would be a coarse brass pot, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Your thoughts on that. Um, but they've interestingly labeled. They've got four brass pots up here, and then four great brass pots listed separately from another great brass pot, which might mean that they're different kinds of great brass pots. So we've got brass pots in all kinds of different sizes. You've got pike pans. Now, a pike pan could well be a pan that is intended specifically for cooking a pike. And I could see that because pike in this era is a very popular fish. And it's so many recipes for pike in all the cookbooks across whether Italy or France or England. Pike and German cookbooks as well from this era. Pike are a very common fish in recipes anyway. How common they are in reality, I don't know, but there's lots of recipes for them. The reason I don't know is because I'm generally not a fish fan. So there's very specific and somewhat limited range of fish that I like. So I generally my eyes, I think just naturally glaze over fish recipes because I'm worried that it will be a fishy fish. I don't like fishy fish. Mackerel is right out. Yeah. But then some of the equipment that's really interesting to me. Skimmers of brass and ladles of brass. And we talked about skimmers, and I've seen 15th century depiction of skimmers, and they look very similar to modern skimmers. They are literally, it's a disc of metal that I'm assuming is hammered flat, and holes are poked in it. And then you just literally, with a long handle, and you literally skim that across the top of your pot when you're cooking. Just like in modern recipes, if you're preparing meat and you have to parboil meat, the scum always comes to the top, which is all the things you don't want to incorporate into the dish. And modern recipes often say skim the top, right? Medieval recipes also often specify to skim your pot once it's come to a boil if you put meat in there. And sometimes it says to skim it multiple times. So you need a skimmer for that. And they did, in fact, have a special purpose implement called a skimmer, unoriginally. Trivets. Trivets in this era are not for protecting surfaces from hot pans. Trivets in this area are cooking implements. So a trivet, it's called a trivet because it's a triangle. It's a metal triangle, hammered metal that's been hammered flat, and it's got legs. And you put that in the coals, and then your pot or your pan goes on top of the trivet. And that way you actually control the heat, not by making your fire bigger or greater. No, your fire generally should be coals anyway. But you can move the trivet closer into the coals or towards the coals and further away from the coals. And that's how you control the heat on your pan. The good thing about a trivet is you don't need a system for hanging your pots. And you can just move the trivet closer to the coals, or you can put it on top of the coals if you need to, or move it away from the coals to control your temperature. I prefer that over the suspension system for hanging pots. But they've got that too in Sir John Fastolf's kitchen, because he actually has two pot hooks. Although it doesn't say anything, it doesn't actually specify the mechanism itself. But by the end of the 15th century, they actually have kitchens have gotten very sophisticated. And like by the second half of the 15th century, and they actually have these really complex, if you do a search for a 15th century kitchen, you'll probably be able to find 15th century German kitchen woodcut. Yeah, you'll probably be able to find exactly the image for which I'm looking. And it's this complex hook system that you can actually adjust the pot up and down, and it locks in place. So you extend it, and the little tooth actually locks in another tooth, right? So that's how you could also control the heat on your suspended pot. But then you're possibly, you're working right over the coals, and I prefer trivets. I definitely prefer cooking with trivets. Then it talks about spits. There are 4 spits in this kitchen. Spitting your meat was the way of roasting meat. Meat was not roasted in an oven. It was spit roasted. It was rotisseried. But the humans were generally the rotisserie, except that by the second half of the 15th century, we actually have visual evidence of a heat-driven spit, an automatic spit. So there's actually a fan attached. There's a fan that's on a rotating bar that attaches to a wheel that actually turns the spit. So as the heat from the fire rises, the smoke and the heat rises, it drives the fan. The fan spins the rod turns the spit, and then you no longer have to turn the spit yourself. It's in the same woodcut as from the 15th century German kitchen scene. Yeah. So yeah, I just love the idea that by the 15th century, we're really starting to automate things using, without doubling on energy use, because you're just naturally using the heat, the escaping heat from cooking. They're capturing that and turning that into energy for their rotisserie, so that you no longer have to have a spit boy, because otherwise, spit boy is the worst job in the kitchen, in my opinion. Double checking on that. Yeah, it's worse than washing dishes. Being the spit boy is definitely worse than washing dishes. The spit boy was literally, it's always, as far as I know, it was always a boy or a young man anyway. And literally his whole job was to stand there and turn the spit. And because you were right next to the fire, it was hot, it was gruesome, it was tedious, but you had to turn. You just had to keep slowly turning, because if you didn't turn it, then one side would get more cooked and overcooked than the other. But I think in certain kitchens, at least you got extra beer or something like that as like compensation for your woes. If beer is something you like. But one of the neat things about spit roasting meat is that and they've got here, one droppings pan. So the dropping pan is literally, it's a long, long pan, and it doesn't specify here whether it's metal or not. I've seen extant ones that are ceramic. So we could perhaps go on an assumption that in terms of the pans and containers, if a metal isn't specified, you could maybe assume that means it's ceramic, and it didn't matter because ceramic was kind of the disposable material of the Middle Ages. So that dropping pan could well be ceramic. I've seen extant 15th century dropping pans, and they're oblong, pretty long, because it needs to fit under the whole chunk of meat. And they actually do have a little spout that could feed off into a dish, right? Would feed off into a dish, so that your spit juices are also not going to waste, and then they can be captured and turned into some kind of sauce. But also, you don't want them falling onto the hot coals or the fire, because if they fall into the hot coals, the fat from the dripping juices, well, all the dripping juices, including the fats, are going to burst, and they're going to burn you. So the dripping pan may have been less of an idea of, we're going to catch these drippings and we're going to use them for a gravy the way we do in La Nouvelle Cuisine, the modern world. It was just as much about, we need to protect our spit boy and or our cooks from getting second degree burns or worse from the explosive juices from the spit roast. Yeah. Yeah, man had quite a bit of stuff. Brass pots are excellent appliances for the use of cooking. Agree 100%. I would wonder if coarse brass would mean it was cast instead of made of sheet brass, or conversely, that it was made of raw brass instead of tin. Oh yeah, see, Takeda, I knew you would have ideas. You're my metal person. You're my metallurgist, right? Ah, so glad to have you in my household. You always have such good contributions. Pike are large fish. Yes, they are. Will I eat sole? Sole is mahi mahis can be okay. I like mahi mahi. I do have 2 copper pots and 3 Dutch pots. The copper retains the heat very well. Copper, yeah. Copper is a wonderful substance to cook with, but it has to be properly tinned. Everyone, please do not use copper pots or pans unless their tin is intact. And if their tin is not intact, have them retinned, because you do not want to get copper poisoning. Trust me, not something you want. Yeah, pike is a large fish, an aggressive fish. I think they're related to sturgeon. Yeah. Yeah, I think they are related to sturgeon as well. Let me see. I feel like a rough pot would be lower quality than a hammered one. Yeah. I think Viking, maybe you're right about that. Yeah. The fan-driven spit is a pretty interesting idea, isn't it? Let's see. Then we've got our sieves, like we just talked about in our last recipe. Maybe I should have led off with this and then went to the recipe. Oh well. At the time, it seemed like it was fun to go with the recipe and then get to the equipment, but maybe it makes more sense to read about the equipment and then go to the recipe? What do you all think? Would you have preferred me to have read the equipment list first and then gone into the recipe, or is this order of operations acceptable as well? Just let me know. Right, so we have a brass sieve and a wooden sieve, or colander, colander, as we would call them modernly. What's fascinating is the 15th century English word is colander, C-U, one of the four spellings that I've seen, Cullender. So the word colander is in fact an old 15th century, an old at least dating to the 15th century English word, and we're still using it to this day for basically the exact same object, which I think is great. When we actually have that kind of continuity of purpose and meaning in both the device and the language, I find that really fascinating, and I just love those connections. So we've got the brass sieve and we've got a wooden sieve. So, again, you've got two different kinds of sieves, and that makes sense that, you would have different kinds of sieves for different purposes. Especially if you're working in something, a material that needs more resistance, then you'll use your brass sieve. And maybe if something that needs less resistance you don't need to press so hard to get it to do the work for you, then maybe you have your wooden sieve. Right. So for people who are looking to recreate medieval kitchen implements, lists like this can be invaluable for helping inform the materials out of which they can be made, because the archaeological record isn't always there, literally. A lot of these materials rot in the ground, so they don't necessarily survive. But here we have documentary evidence that can fill in the holes in the archaeological record. Okay, so then we've got a grater. They've got a grater, right? So some of you have asked me, when they say to grate a recipe, grate something, what do they mean? They mean like we think of a grater. Now, granted, I haven't seen any evidence of a box grater. What I have seen is like a grater like this, and it's curved, and it's got a handle that curves out from it. So you hold it like this, and then you grate, right? So that's the kind of grater I've seen, but it's still the same idea. It's a sheet of metal with raised holes lifted out of it so that you can grate your material finely or not so finely. And they had graters with different gauge holes, though, just the way we do. Just no one yet, I guess. I don't know. I've never seen a box grater. If any of you have evidence of a box grater from the Middle Ages, let me know. No, I have seen box graters from the 19th century, but I don't think I've seen a box grater from before that era. And I seem to recall that someone actually is credited with having invented and patented the box grater, but I may be misremembering that. Right. So along the line of sieves, they've got a strainer. Right now, granted, it doesn't say anything about this strainer. It doesn't say if it's made of metal, if it's made of fabric, if it's got a wood frame. We don't know, but they have an object whose sole purpose is to strain substances, right? They have that. They've got tongs. Again, I don't know how these tongs look. Now, for many of these objects in the 17th century, in about 1570, not about, in 1570, a book is published by the head cook in the Pope's court. His name is Scappi, and he publishes his opera, his great work. And it's a detailed cooking manual that also details all of the kitchen equipment you need to be a good cook, with pictures. Now, granted, that's 1570, that's 100 years after, 140 years after this particular letter. So God knows there's been a lot of really rapid advancement and innovation in those intervening 140 years, but still, it will give you a better idea of the medieval kitchen equipment to look in Scappi's work than to look at your own kitchen, right? So it might not be perfect for giving you a visual representation of 15th century kitchen devices, but Scappi's opera is definitely a good reference to at least get you heading in the right direction for how medieval kitchen equipment would have looked. Yeah, exactly. Like a cheese grater, Richard, just like a cheese grater. Susan says recipe first, maybe because we can wonder about the kitchen and its contents. Yeah, that's true. Then I can fill in the blanks. And then the interesting thing, what I think is very interesting, is vinegar bottle is specifically mentioned, not an oil cruet, a vinegar bottle, which should tell you how important vinegar was as an ingredient in this era. And it's not for salads. They did have herb salatus as they were herbis salatus of herbis, as they were called in the 15th century, but they're not super common. The more common use for vinegar is in like every other dish, in stews, in soups, in pottages, in cooking meat, in making did I already say sauces? Sauces. Lots of sauces are vinegar based in this era. So if any of you are familiar with mint sauce that traditionally goes with lamb, the real mint sauce, not the horrible, not mint jelly, mint sauce. It's tart and it's vinegary and it's minty, right? And salty and not sweet. Not sweet at all. That is actually a holdover from medieval green sauce. So it's one of the there's a couple of holdovers in modern English cuisine, that things that have actually survived the degradation of cuisine from the Middle Ages to this day. And real mint sauce, not mint jelly, not mint jelly's gross, not mint jelly, but mint sauce. That is absolutely a holdover from medieval cuisine. In the 15th century, did they use a mincer? Richard, when you say a mincer, what do you mean? Do you mean a food processor? I mean, for the most part, knife work. So there seem to have been the ways that medieval kitchens seem to have rendered food small, shall we say? The way they rendered food small, knife work, very common way to make things small. They had graters, depending on the thing. They could render it smaller by pushing it through a sieve. They could sometimes you actually get instructions for straining substances through cloths, literally like squeezing it out through the cloth, depending on the substance. Or smashing in a mortar and pestle. Mortar and pestle. The mortar and pestle is maybe the mortar and pestle in combination with the grater and the sieve are like all those three things together are the medieval food processor. So yeah, mortar and pestle is like the main way to make things super fine and a uniform paste. Would there be honey in jars? Yeah, so honey would have been kept in jars, and they definitely had honey in their kitchens. It's interesting that it's not labeled here, but this is the kitchen goods. So these are the items that are in the kitchen itself. This is not his food stores, right? We're not talking about the food store. But yeah, honey was definitely kept in jars. Ceramic jars. Yeah, ceramic jars. Yeah. Yeah. Honey was relatively abundant. Just remember that they had not industrialized beekeeping the way we have. Yes, I mean it's not like they didn't just have one single hive, but honey was not available with the sort of um, you know ready nature that it is now. So it was still considered a luxury good. Honey was not considered a poor person's food. It was still a luxury item because you still had to keep the honey, or you had to screw your courage to the sticking place and go climb that tree after the hive that's up in the tree and risk the wrath of angry bees as you steal their honey like Winnie the Pooh, right? So honey was still considered a luxury item in this era. Okay, are there any other questions about our larded milk or the implements that were contained in a middling sort in a gentry kitchen from 1430 in England? Any other final comments before we move on to our next text in our medieval story time? Oh, mincer as in mincing meat. So you mean grinding? No, I have no evidence of meat grinders from this era. Thank you, Richard, for clarifying. Right. No, I have no evidence of meat grinders from this era. In fact, it seems that they did not grind raw meat even. The process in all the recipes I've read over the years, whenever they want meat to be minced, they cook it first and then they mince it. They shred it, they mince it with a knife, and then they apply it to the next thing, including for sausage, by the way. So yeah, I, medieval sausage was probably a very different thing from what we understand it as being now. Yeah, no, I've never no meat grinders, as we'd say in American English, no meat mincers. No, it seems that it was knife work that would be used to accomplish that. And generally, you cook the meat first and then you mince it. Interestingly, that's a great question. Thank you for that question, Richard. If they had hives, how close were they to the house? Uh, Pretty close. They were kept in their gardens, as far as we can tell. You're not just gonna, yeah. I'm actually, you know what? Now that I'm saying this, I don't want to answer that question because there were commons. in a lot of places. And so it wouldn't surprise me if perhaps they kept their hives in some part of the commons, or in some part of the forest that was designated as being a commons. It depends on the estate, it depends on your farm, it depends on uh, your living situation in terms of geography. You would want your hives, though. Farmers understood the interactions between bees and pollination, wow, pollination, even if they didn't necessarily understand it from, at the microscopic level, but they understood the process. They understood that bees made plants fertile. And so they would have wanted the hives to be close enough to their fields, for instance, that the bees would pollinate their crops and their trees and their orchards. So in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if there is a relationship between beekeepers and orchards, because you would want the bees to pollinate your orchards for you. But now we're entering the realm of supposition because I haven't looked deeply into medieval apiary. What was considered luxury kitchen equipment? Yeah, so anything made out of metal would have been luxury kitchen equipment. Ceramic was the common material. It was literally made from dirt and didn't require a whole lot of processing to arrive at a finished ceramic product. To arrive, and Takea is going to back me up here, to arrive at a finished metal product is so many stages of production and processing and craftsmanship. Anything made out of metal would have been considered a high-end kitchen good. And luxury, not in the sense of that only royalty had it, but luxury in that you had to have a pretty decent income in order to have them. So for a peasant, for instance, to have metal kitchen items, that meant they were pretty well off as peasants. Yeah, so it depends on what you mean by luxury good, right? Like that word can be so so differently interpreted. But in my view, anything made out of metal in the 15th century would have ipso facto been at some level a luxury good. The higher the quality of metal, maybe not out of lead. Pewter was kind of everybody could afford things in pewter basically by the 15th century. But items made out of brass, items made out of iron, items made out of copper, right? These kinds of metals would have definitely been on the more expensive luxury end. Yep. Oh, AC Dilno, welcome back. I was just thinking of Tajikistan this morning and how very much I want to go there. And you're back. Oh, it's so wonderful to have you back. Thank you for joining us again. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Isabella, for that wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's so great to hear you from Tajikistan. Oh gosh, I was wondering, I hadn't seen you in a couple of live streams, so I was just thinking about Tajikistan this morning, honestly, seriously. Um, my grandpa kept the hives near his house. Easy to believe that they did the same in medieval times as well. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, but for all that, you would want them to be near where you wanted things pollinated. You don't want people stealing your bees. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And if there are any medieval historical apiary experts out there, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. 100%. How about specific cooking utensils and devices only the rich had? So it can be hard to tell what only the rich had. Um, Not because we don't know what the rich had, we know what they had. We don't know what people in very low stations had because their lives aren't as documented. I will say that, for instance, there are collections of wills from all over Europe, from various levels of society. There are a collection of wills in York. There's a collection of wills in Dublin, for instance, that I've examined from the 15th century at some depth and at some length. And these are actually from members, most levels of society, including people we might consider to be fairly poor, not homeless, but not wealthy. And yeah, the goods that they mention in their wills are much sparser. So, for example, this list of kitchen equipment we just had, graters and strainers, and I think probably people at the lower end of society probably wouldn't have had, specialized pans. They wouldn't have had pike pans, and they wouldn't have had they would maybe have had a strainer, but they wouldn't have had specialized equipment, right? They would have had the basics that you don't need specialized equipment at a certain level if you're clever and you don't mind a little more fuss and muss. I know, because when I was a poor student years ago, I had a very basically equipped kitchen and I got by. And I do mean basic. I didn't even have a colander. And I still managed to get by. by improvising with the little bit of equipment I had. So, having all these specialized tools like strainers, like graters, different kinds of sieves, for instance, different kinds of pans and pots for specific dishes, right? That's all nice to have, but not must have in order to even make those dishes. So I'm pretty certain my feeling is that the specialized equipment probably would not have been present in the kitchens of the less well heeled, right? They would have had pots, probably ceramic pots. They would have had wooden spoons, absolutely. They would have had a knife. I mean, knife, if you didn't have a knife, you were dead in the water or dead on the land in the Middle Ages. Like the knife was the multi-purpose tool. It was not just used for cooking, it was used for a variety of things. So they would have had a knife. They would have had a surface on which they can cut, cutting board or something like that, because that's made of wood. They would have probably, they would not have had, possibly not even had spits, actually. They probably weren't, because if you're at that end of society, you're not spit roasting anything. Right. So yeah, probably not the spit roast, probably not. Go back to our list. Definitely not a brass mortar and pestle. No. They could have probably had one maybe made of stone if it was carved out of stone, or they could have had a wooden one. They had wooden mortars and pestles. They suck. They suck compared to a brass one, but they probably would have had a wooden mortar and pestle. They probably wouldn't have had um, tongs. They probably wouldn't have had, probably not flesh hooks. Yeah, there's a lot of these specialty items that probably they wouldn't have had, but it can be hard to prove a negative, right? We can talk about what we know they had. It's harder to say what they didn't have. Does that make sense, Isabella? How did they wash dishes? Buckets. Buckets with water. They did have soap. Soap was a thing at this era, and they did use it. Um, I haven't read anything about whether vinegar was added to the water, but we do know that after the dishes were washed, they were scrubbed in salt. And you all are going to scream at me, salt is a luxury item. No, it isn't. There's different grades of salt. So the grade of salt that is not a luxury item is marsh salt, or yeah, which is literally where you just take the water from a brackish marsh, which is a mixture of salt and fresh water, right? You put it in a big pan and you just set it out. You either put it in the sun for it to evaporate if you have enough sunlight, or you put it over the fire. You let the water evaporate, and what's left is this unappealing looking gray salt, and that would be used to actually scrub dishes. And they might not have understood the microbial interactions, why it worked, but they understood that salt would help sterilize, what we call sterilize, purify their implements, and then they would put them in the sun when there was sun, and the UV would take care of the rest. Right. So that's how they clean dishes. So they had buckets, and sometimes they had sinks. Some kitchens actually had sinks. We know because they're detailed in the layout of a kitchen. In fact, in our book of caring, he details the layout of a good kitchen, and he mentions sinks specifically. In the upper end houses, they were often made of marble or stone of some kind. Yeah, you can imagine washing your dishes in a marble sink. What a world. um, did anyone have cast iron dishes? Yes, they did have cast iron by this point. But when you say dishes, you mean cooking vessels, right? Yes, they had cast iron pots at this point. Yep. Let me see. Uh, what about, oh, no, I'm not getting into that. That's not for me. Yeah. Very interesting channel with a lot of historical things connecting it to food and everyday life. So refreshing. Brazil kid, welcome to my community. I'm the creative Contessa. And just a brief reminder, if you're enjoying and watching, please like and subscribe. And I am supported by a number of people, including my generous people who give me super chats, kind of tipping in YouTube, but you can also support me more directly through Patreon or through channel membership on YouTube. Patrons and channel members get access to a whole host, a massive catalog of extra content. We have a monthly live Zoom together. There's a Discord specifically for my patrons and my channel members. So yeah, consider if you want more extras on a regular basis, then consider channel membership or patronage. Kitty time. Yeah. Okay. Let me scroll up. I seem to have missed. Oh yeah. Dilnoza, you have such an influence in Tajikistan, right? You're at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, so you've got such a rich culture, and your food, like Tajik food, is so interesting. Yeah, Tajik food is actually very similar to a lot of medieval Western European food, actually. So yeah, not the same, but very similar. Lots of similar flavors, similar spicing, similar cooking techniques for very good reasons. So yeah. Um, my parents would be more than happy to have you as our guest. I will be taking you up on that, Dylan knows. If you can reach out to me, you can find my website, thecreativecontessa.com, and contact me. I'm serious. I want to go. I want to come and visit you in Tajikistan. I want the real experience. I don't want the tourist experience. Not interested in the tourist experience. I'm past that. um, yeah. Okay. Okay. Back to here. Historian XX BBC2 needs to pick this up. Suzette, Mary, Tackney, thank you. That is fantastic. I would be happy if the BBC picked me up. I could get to a much bigger audience and actually maybe bring some beauty back into a world that needs some beauty right now. Good God, does it? Um, let me see. Why was this done? And isn't it also bad for health if used daily? Cast iron dishes, Dilnoza, are you talking about the cast iron dishes or the salt? Yeah, if you could just specify that, that would be great. And yes, I would absolutely love to come and horse out with your horses. Just absolutely. Horses, I love horses. I love horses as much as I love kitties. Okay. Yeah, so Dilnoza, if you can reach out to me and contact me, either on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or through my website or through my email address, I definitely want to discuss travel plans with you for certain. Yeah, I'm super excited. Like literally I've been dreaming about Tajikistan. Oh, the salt. Right. Thank you. The salt. So the salt is it's scrubbed onto the dishes and then it's rinsed off before the next use, right? You're asking, so the salt is not in the food, it's in the, sorry, the dishes. I mean the cooking vessels. So the cooking vessels are scrubbed down in the salt after they're washed to purify them. And then they're put in the sun to dry. And then you can, if you're worried about there still being salt residue left over, you can just rinse it before you actually use it. It's kind of similar to salting meat. Salting meat is a preservation method. And when you salt meat, you don't just then eat the salted meat. I mean, we do with beef jerky, and it's kind of crazy because medieval people, their version of jerky, all the recipes talk about if you're going to use salted meat, soak it to get the salt out first and then prepare your meat. So it's the same idea. If you're concerned about there being too much salt left on your dish, sorry, my cat just bumped into the camera. If you're concerned about too much salt being left on the dish, you can just rinse it off before you use it because you do want the salt to kind of be there to do its antimicrobial thing. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So everyone, I think we're going to move on to our next reading because we can just talk about this all day. We can talk about kitchens and food all day. Right, so I'm going to give you a choice. Do you want a bawdy, naughty story from Boccaccio's Il Decameron, the 14th century plague era, Great Black Death era collection of naughty stories from Italy, folk tales to flummox you? Or would you like a more erudite and elegant reading from a 15th century dance manual on how this dance master thinks that licentious, lusty bawds should not touch his fine, refined art of dance? Okay, so 15th century dance manual reading, not the whole thing, just an excerpt, or bawdy tale from the Decameron. Let me know briefly which one you would prefer. Yeah, I'm set. And by the way, while I let you all decide, I just want to thank you all for being here today. All of you, whether you're patrons or channel members or super chatters or just wonderful parts of my community, asking all the great questions, sharing my content with other people to actually get to see and learn from, right? I don't know if I consider myself an expert. I consider myself experienced and inquisitive. So I am happy to bring you along on what I call my journey of learning. Learning for me is never done. I'm constantly exploring new sources, reconsidering what I already know. I never think that the journey of learning does not end for me ever. We can we can have both. Yes, you can have both. It's just a question of which one should come next. If I had to pick one, the Black Plague. Well, this will be a nice contrast. So we'll start with the Black Plague, which is 15th century, 14th century Italian, and then we'll go on to the 15th century Italian source, which really sharply contradicts with the the Black Death option. Ah, Dilnoza, thank you so much. I will reach out. I will reach out. My email address is public. It doesn't really matter if I say it here. My email address is thecreativecontessa.com. I know, thecreativecontessa@gmail.com. It's public knowledge, so there's no point in me even pretending. Yeah, thecreativecontessa@gmail.com is my Creative Contessa business address. So, okay, so this is Il Decamerone, which is a play on the word 10 days. During the second Great Plague that destroyed Eurasia, the first being the Justinian Plague, the second is in the mid-15th century. Hits the Black Death, starts in somewhere in the steppes, we think maybe actually in Mongolia, and then works its way through Asia, eastward through Asia, and westward into Europe through merchant ties, the Silk Road and the merchant ships, the Arab trader ships, then into the Mediterranean to the Italian and Spanish trading ships, right? And then the rats bring the fleas, and the bubonic plague spreads like wildfire. And it kills about 50% of the population of Europe. But you think that's bad, but then you realize the Justinian plague killed like 90%. Even worse, but 50% is pretty awful. And of course, there are various theories at the time that arise as to the cause of the ailment. Some people say it's because we are so sinful and fallen and that God has sent this plague upon us to punish us and cleanse us clean. Other people have theories about miasma and, of course, Really, Chimi? Really? The cats are getting ornery. There are various theories about miasmas, foul air, sort of carrying the contagion, and they don't know what the contagion is specifically, but they understand that there is one. They understand that there is infection and there is transmission. Right? Medieval people weren't stupid. They might not have had microscopy, but they did understand at the base level there is something that is going from one person to the other. They didn't necessarily understand how or why or what specifically, but they understood that it was. One of the theories that arose is that they noticed, anyway, that in the cities, the rate of transmission was far higher and the rate of death was far more grievous than it was in dispersed communities. And so many noblemen, many members of the aristocracy, those wealthy who had country estates, would flee to their country estates in the hopes of escaping it there. And sometimes that worked, but often it didn't. At first it worked, but eventually the Black Death caught up with him. So Il Decamerone is a compilation of folk tales, of a variety of kind of folk tales, from tragic histories to alarming domestic comedies, all the way to rollicking fantasy adventures. It's a fantastic collection of stories. Oh, here's my actual copy of the Decameron. Well, I guess I should put things away better. Anyway. And it's Giovanni Boccaccio who compiles it, and it's written in the vernacular. It's written in Tuscan Italian, right? It's written in the Italian of Dante. And so it's revolutionary on a lot of levels because, there isn't much, there's almost no literature, vanishingly little literature in Italy before this era that is in Italian, right? You have Petrarca, you've got Dante, and you've got Boccaccio. And so the other thing that's amazing about it is that it's like folk tales, right? This isn't great literature in the sense of tales of knights errant and great queens and sorceresses in the woods, right? Some of these are downright alarming by modern standards. And he is a contemporary of Chaucer, and there's some evidence that Chaucer actually met Boccaccio. I mean, how awesome is that? In any case, for certain, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales purloins some of the stories from Boccaccio's Decameron. The Decameron predates Chaucer's Canterbury Tales by about 30 years, 20 years or 30 years, something like that, right? So definitely crossover. And, Chaucer's idea is not the first one of we're going to create a compilation of folk tales and we're going to frame it. So that's what Boccaccio also does in the Decameron. He frames the story. So in this case, the frame is the Black Death. Chaucer's frame is certainly more merry. So Boccaccio's frame is the Black Death. It's Florence. It's the end, it's like the end of the 1440s. And these Florentine aristocrats, and they're referred to as aristocrats, even though Florence, 1340s, 1340s, not 1440s, 1340s. And this group of young and nubile and energetic and lusty nobles, flees from the city, from Florence, because 14th century Florence, I mean, talk about densely populated, crazily densely populated medieval Florence is. The sunlight doesn't touch the streets there. That's how densely built up Florence is. So they flee the city of Florence and they go to Fiesole, which is modernly about 5 miles outside of Florence. But at the time, 5 miles obviously was a longer distance than it is now. So they flee to a country, one of their country estates in Fiesole, and they then proceed to disport in all the sorts of pleasures they can possibly concoct, holding picnics and feasts and dancing and games and explorations, walks through the countryside, etc., etc. But one of the things they do is on each of the different days, because they need to have order to their little court, they elect a monarch for the day. And so each day is governed by a monarch who determines what it is they shall do on that day, but also what the themes of the story shall be, because they also decide that they're going to, each of them, 10 members of the company, 3 men and 7 women. Guess it's good to be a man in this particular company in Fiesole. Each of them will tell a story every day. So for 10 days, 10 stories are told on each day, meaning 100 stories total, which means les 100 nouvelles from the 15th century is based on this idea as well. And each of the days seems to have a kind of theme. Like one of the days focuses on daring do, one of the days focuses on women's liberation, different topics. So we're actually going to read the first novel of the third day. Okay. So the first novel, oh, and I forgot to mention, there is the earliest complete English translation of which I'm aware was translated actually in 1620 by John Florio, who was an Englishman, but he was natively bilingual. One parent was Italian, one parent was English. So he grew up speaking both languages. And so he's actually uniquely positioned to do a proper translation of the text. So there are earlier sections are translated, but this is a complete translation of the entire book. And because it's 1620, the English in which he writes is very reminiscent of Shakespeare's English. So it's lots of fun as an English translation goes. It might not be the most accurate because he took some creative license in order to create better flow in his writing, but I think it's the most fun translation of all the translations out there. Yeah. The Decameron, translated by John Florio. Yeah. Okay. So before we we need to we're going to look at the comments one last time, and then reminder, the format is I will read through the text in its entirety, and then we will go back and discuss it. Okay. Let me see. Learning is a ship through the cosmos. Agree 100%. Let me see. Mary, Suzette, thank you. You know what you're talking about? Lucy Worsley needs to know about this. I love Lucy Worsley. She's an inspiration for me. Yeah, definitely love Lucy. This is almost the end of the 100 Years' War, right? No, so Brasil Kid, this is the 1340s. This is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. In fact, the Black Death puts a big pause in the 100 Years' War. Big pause. Big pause in the 100 Years' War. Okay. Dilnoza, I will come back to that question after the story, okay? Let me just read cutlery in the past. I've heard all kinds of cutlery for cutting grapes smaller, even if we cut off the main vines. Yeah, but I will briefly answer you. Yes, there was in the 14th and 15th century, they definitely had certain knives that were specialty items. And by the 16th century, they definitely had specialty knives, lots of specialty knives. But there were special knives. It was a hooked kind of a hooked thing for cutting grapes off of grapevines. Yep. Okay, so Il Decamerone by Giovanni Boccaccio. The Third Day, the first novel, wherein it is declared that virginity is very hardly to be kept in all places. Not far from Alexandria, there was a great and goodly monastery belonging to the lord of those parts, who is termed the Admiral, and therein, under the care and trust of one woman, diverse virgins were kept as recluses or nuns, vowed to chastity of life, out of whose number the Sultan of Babylon, under whom they lived in subjection, at every 3 years' end, had usually 3 of these virgins sent to him. At the time whereof I am now to speak, there remained in the monastery no more but 8 religious sisters only, beside the lady abbessa and an honest poor man, who was a gardener and kept the garden in commendable order. His wages being small, and he not well contented therewith, would serve there no longer, but making his accounts even with the factotum or bailiff belonging to the house, returning thence to the village of Lamporecchio, being a native of the place. Among many other that gave him welcome home was a young Hebrew peasant of the country, sturdy, strong, and yet comely of person, being named being named Maset. But because he was born not far off from Lamporecchio, and had there been brought up his younger days, his name of Maset, according to their vulgar tongue, was turned to Masetto, and therefore he was usually called and known by the name of Masetto of Lamporecchio. Masetto, falling in talk with the honest poor man, whose name was Lorco, demanded of him what services he had done in the monastery, having continued there so long a time. Quoth Lorco, I labored in the garden, which was very fair and great. Then I went to the forest to fetch home wood, and cleft it for their chamber fuel, drawing up all their water beside, with many other toilsome services else. But the allowance of my wages was so little as it would not pay for the shoes I wore. And that which was worst of all, they being all young women, I think the devil dwells among them, for a man cannot do anything to please them. When I have been busy at my work in the garden, one would come and say, put this here, put that there. And others would take the dibble out of my hand, telling me that I did not perform anything well, making me so weary of their continual trifling, as I have left all business, given over the garden, and what for one molestation, as also many other, I intended to tarry no longer there, but came away, as thou seest. And yet the factotum desired me at my departing, that if I knew anyone who would undertake the aforesaid labors, I should send him thither, as indeed I promised to do. But let me fall sick and die before I hope to send them any. When Masetto had heard the words of Lorco, he was so desirous to dwell among the nonnas that nothing else now hammered in his head. Or he meant more subtly than poor Lorco did, and made no doubt to please them sufficiently. Then, considering with himself how best he might bring his intent to effect, which appeared not easily to be done, he could question no further therein with Lorco, but only demanded other matter of him, saying, in troth, thou didst well, Lorco, to come away from so tedious a dwelling. Had he not need to be more than a man that is to live with such women? It were better for him to dwell among so many devils, because they understand not the 10th part that women's wily wits can dive into. After their conference was ended, Masetto began to beat his brains how he might compass to dwell among them. And knowing that he could well enough perform all the labors whereof Lorco had made mention, he cared not for any loss he should sustain thereby, but only stood in doubt of his entertainment, because he was too young and sprightly Having pondered on many imaginations, he said to himself, "The place is far enough distant hence, and none there can take knowledge of me. If I have wit sufficient, cleanly to make them believe that I am dumber, then questionless shall I be received." Dumber means mute. Yeah, means no hearing and mute. Dumb and deaf, right? Dumb and deaf. Um, and resolving to prosecute this determination, excuse me, dumb means he cannot speak, mute. And resolving to prosecute this determination, he took a spada on his shoulder, and without revealing to anybody whither he went, in the disguise of a poor laboring countryman, he traveled to the monastery. When he was there arrived, he found the great gate open, and entering in boldly, it was his good hap to espy the factotum in the court, according as Lorco had given description of him. Making a sinus before him, as if he were both dumb and deaf, he manifested that he craved an alms for God's sake, making shewis beside that if need required, he could cleave wood and do any reasonable kind of service. The factotum gladly gave him food, and afterward shewed him divers knotty logs of wood, which the weak strength of Lorco had left uncloven. But this fellow, being more active and lusty, quickly rent them all to pieces. Now, it so fell out that the factotum must needs go to the forest. Excuse me. Now, it fell so out that the factotum must needs go to the forest, and he took Masetto along with him thither, where, causing him to fell diverse trees by sinus, he bade him to lada the 2 asses therewith, which commonly carried home all the wood, and so drive them to the monastery before him, which Masetto knew well enough how to do, and performed it very effectually. Many other servile offices were there to be done, which caused the factotum to make use of his penis divers other days beside, in which time the lady abbess, chancing to see him, demanded of the factotum what he was. "Madam," quoth he, "a poor laboring man, who is both deafa and dumba, hither he came to crave an alms the other day, the which in charity I could do no lesse but give him, for which he hath done many honest services about the house. It seemeth besides that he hath pretty skill in gardening, so that if I can persuade him to continue here, I make no question of his able services, for the old silly man is gone, and we have need of such a stout fellow to do the business belonging to the monastery. And one fitter for the torna comes seldom hither. Moreover, in regard of his double imperfections, the sisters can sustana no impeachment by him." Whereto the abbess answered, saying, "By the faith of my body, you speak of but the truth. Understand then, if he have any knowledge in gardening, and whether he will dwell here or no, which compasses so kindly as you can. Let him have a new pair of shoes, fill his belly daily full of meat, flatter and make much of him, for we shall find him work enough to do." All which the factotum promised to fulfill sufficiently. Masetto, who was not far off from them all this while, but seemed seriously busied about sweeping and making clean of the court, heard all these speeches, of course, and being not a little joyful of them, said to himself, "If once I come to work in your garden, let the proof yield praise of my skill and knowledge." When the factotum perceived that he knew perfectly well how to undergo his business, and had questioned him by sinus concerning his willingness to serve there still, and received the like answer also of his dutiful readiness thereto, He gave him order to work in the garden, because the season did now require it, and to leave all other affairs for the monastery, attending now only to the garden's preparation. As Masetto was thus about his garden employment, the nunnas began to resort thither, and thinking the man to be dumba and defa indeed, were the more lavish of their language, mocking and flouting him very immodestly, as being persuaded that he heard them not. And the lady Abessa, thinking he might as well be a eunuch, as deprived both of hearing and speaking, stood the lesser in fear of the sisters' walkis, but referred them to their own care and providence. Oh, mistake, foreshadowing. On a day, Macetta, having labored somewhat extraordinarily, lay down to rest himself for a while under the trees, and two delicate young nunnas, walking there to take the air, drew nearer to the place where he dissembled sleeping. And both of them, observing his comeliness of person, began to pity the poverty of his condition, but much more the misery of his great defectus. Then one of them, who had a little livelier spirit than the other, thinking Masetto to be fast asleep, began in this manner. Sister, quoth she, if I were faithfully assured of thy secrecy, I would tell thee a thing which I have often thought on, and it may perhaps redound to thy profit. Sister, replied the other nun, speak of your mind boldly, and believe it on my maidenhead that I will never reveal it to any creature living. Encouraged by this solemn answer, the first nun thus prosecuted her former purpose, saying, I know not, sister, whether it hath entered into thine understanding or no, how strictly we are kept here and attended, never any man daring to adventure among us except our good and honest factotum, who is very aged. And this dumb fellow, maimed and made imperfect by nature, and therefore not worthy of the title of a man. Ah, sister, it hath oftentimes been told me by gentle women coming hither to visit us, that all other sweetest in the world are mockeries to the incomparable pleasure of a man and a woman, of which we are barred by our unkind parents, binding us to perpetual chastity, which they were never able to observe themselves. A sister of this house once told me that before her Torna came to be sent to the Soldana, she fell in frailty with a man that was both lame and blind, and discovering the same to her ghostly father in confession, he absolved her of that sin, affirming that she had not transgressed with a man because he wanted his rationale and understanding parts. Behold, sister, here lies a creature almost formed in the same mold, dumba and defa, which are the two most rational and understanding parts that do belong to any man, and therefore no man wanting them. If folly and frailty would be committed with him, as many times since he came hither it hath run in my mind, he is by nature sworn to such secrecy that he cannot, if he would, be a blaba thereof. Beside, the laws and constitution of our religion doth teach us that a sin so assuredly concealed is more than half absolved. Ave Maria, sister, said the other nun, what kind of words are these you utter? Do you not know that we have promised our virginity to God? Oh, sister, answered the other, how many things are promised to him every day, and not one of 1,000 kept or performed. If we have made him such a promise, and some of our weaker witted sisters do perform it for us, no doubt, but he will accept it in part of payment. Yea, but sister, replied the second nun again, there is another danger lying in the way. If we prove to be with childe, how shall we do then? Sister, quoth our courageous wench, thou art afraid of harm before it happen. If it comes so to passa, let us consider on it then. Thou art but a novice in matters of such moment. We are provided of 1,000 means whereby to prevent conception. Or if they should fail, we are so surely fitted that the world shall never know it. Let it suffice, our lives must not be by any so much as suspected, our monastery questioned, or our religion rashly scandalized. Thus she schooled her younger sister in wit, albeit as forward as she in will, and longed as desirously to know what kind of creature the man was. After some other questions, how this intention of theirs might be safely brought to full effect, the sprightly nun that had wit at will thus answered, You see, sister, quoth she, it is now the hour of midday, when all the rest of our sisterhood are quiet in their chambers, because we are then allowed to sleep for our earlier rising to morning matins. Here are none in the garden now but ourselves. And while I awake him, be you the watch, and afterward follow me in my fortune, for I will valiantly lead you the way. Masetto, imitating a dogg's sleep, heard all the conspiracy intended against him, and longed as earnestly till she came to awake him, which, being done, he seeming very simple and sottish, and she cheering him with flattering behavior, into the close arbor they went, which the sun's bright eye could not pierce into. And there I leave it to the nunness own approbation whether Masetto was a man rational or no. Ill deeds require longer time to contrive than act. And both the nuns, having been with Masetto at this new form of confession, were enjoined by him such an easy and silent penance as brought them oftener to shrift, and made him to prove a very perfect confessor. Desirous obtained, but not fully satisfied, do commonly urge more frequent access. Then wisdom thinketh expedient, or can continue without discovery. Are two jovial nonnas not a little proud of their private stolen pleasures, so long resorted to the close arbor, till another sister, another sister who had observed their haunt thither often, by meanness of a little hole in her window, that she began to suspect them with Masetto, and imparted the same to two other sisters, all three concluding to accuse them before the lady abbess. But upon further conference with the offenders, they changed opinion, took the same oath as the four women had done, and because they would be free from any taxation at all, they revealed their adventures to the other three ignorants, and so fell all eight into one formal confederacy, but by good and wary observation, lest the abbessa herself should descry them, finding poor Masetto such plenty of garden work as made him very doubtful in pleasing them all. It came to pass in the end that the lady abbessa, who all this while imagined no such matter, walking all alone in the garden on a day, found Masetto sleeping under an almond tree, having there very little business to do, because he had wrought hard all the night before. He had wrought hard all the night before. Wrought hard. Uh-huh. She observed him to be and handsome man, young, lusty, well-limbed and proportioned, having a merciful commiseration of his dumbness and deafness, being persuaded also in like manner, that if he were an eunuch too, he deserved 1,000 times the more to be pitied. The season was exceeding hot, and he lay down so carelessly to sleep that something was noted wherein she intended to be better resolved, almost falling sick of the other nunn's disease. Having awaked him, she commanded him by signs that he should follow her to her chamber, where he was kept close so long that the nunnes grew offended because the gardener came not to his daily labor. Well, may you imagine that Masetto was no proud man now, to be thus advanced from the garden to the chamber, and by no worse woman than the lady abbess herself. What signs shoes or what language he speaks there, I'm not able to express. Only it appeared that his behavior pleased her so well as it procured his daily repairing thither, and acquainted her with such familiar conversation as she would have condemned in the nunnes her daughters, but that they were wise enough to keep it from her. Now began Masetto to consider that he had undertaken a task belonging to great Hercules in giving content to so many, and by continuing Doma in this manner, it would redound to his no mean detriment. Whereupon, as he was one night sitting by the abbessa, the string that retained his tongue from speech brake on a sudden, and thus he spake. Madam, I have often heard it said that one cock may do service to 10 several hennes, but 10 men can very hardly, even with all their best endeavor, give full satisfaction every way to one woman. And yet, I am tied to content 9, which is far beyond the compass of my power to do. Already I have performed so much garden and chamber work that I confess myself stark tired, and can travail no further, and therefore let me entreat you to license my departure hence, or find some means for my better ease. The abbess, hearing him speak, who had so long been their dumma, being stricken into admiration and accounting it almost a miracle, said, How cometh this to pass? I verily believed thee to be dumma. Madam, quoth Masetto, so I was indeed, but not by nature. Only I had a long lingering sickness, which bereft me of speech, and which I have not only recovered again this night, but shall ever remain thankful to you for it. The abbess verily credited his answer, demanding what he meant in saying that he did service to 9. Madam, quoth he, this were a dangerous question, and not easily answered before all the 8 sisters. Upon this reply, the abbessa plainly perceived that not only she had fallen into folly, but all the nunnes likewise cried guilty too. Wherefore, being a woman of sound discretion, she would not grant that Masetto should depart, but to keep him still about the nunnes business, because the monastery should not be scandalized by him. And the factotum being dead a little before, his strange recovery of speech revealed, and some things else more nearly concerning them, by general consent, and with the good liking of Masetto, he was created the factotum of the monastery. All the neighboring people dwelling thereabout, who knew Masetto to be Domba by fetching home wood daily from the forest and diverse employments in other places, were made to believe that by the nunnes devout prayers and discipline, as also the merity of the saint in whose honor the monastery was built and erected, Masetto had his long restrained speech restored, and was now become their sole factotum. having power now to employ others in drudgeries, and ease himself of all such labors. And albeit he made the nunnes to be fruitful by increasing some store of younger sisters, yet all matters were so close and cleanly carried as it was never talked of, till after the death of the lady Abbessa, when Masetto began to grow in good years, and desired to return home to his native abiding, which, within a while after, was granted to him. Thus, Masetto, being rich and old, returned home like a wealthy father, taking no care for the nursing of his children, but bequeathed them to the place where they were bred and born, having, by his wit and ingenious apprehension, made such a benefit of his youthful years that now he merrily took ease in his age. The end. Right. Okay. So that is the first novel on the third day, The Tale of Masetto of Lamporecchio and the Nunnery of Alexandria. Okay. So I will now go back and look in the comments and answer any questions. Okay. So first things, oh goodness. This author, yes. So Richard, the question is, Giovanni Boccaccio, did he live before the Marquis de Sade? As Susan says, yes. Marquis de Sade is French Revolution, 18th century. So second half of the 18th century. So that's, the 1750 to 1790 something, basically, because he was executed in the part of the French Revolution, if I recall correctly. So that would have been, yeah, this is 400 years before the Marquis de Sade. Absolutely. Yep. Okay, other questions? The tone in which she reads, close your eyes and it feels as though you're, oh, thank you, Dilnoza. That's so lovely of you to say so. Oh, we didn't die in the French Revolution. Interesting. Okay. I did bring tea. I should have some tea. You're right. Let me see. Derby, thank you so much. Eunuch, yeah. So remember, so there's some interesting things I'd like to address here, and this we actually talked in one of the recent live streams about disability, other ability, how people with mobility issues might handle life in the Middle Ages, and so this story actually kind of dovetails into that discussion that we had, because here we talk about a man who's at least perceived as being dumb and deaf, as being mute and deaf, as not being able to hear or speak. And you can glean a lot of the medieval attitude towards deafness and dumbness, because it's a major plot point, actually. These nuns and the Lady Abbess think it's perfectly acceptable that to engage in pleasures of the flesh, shall we say, with this man, because he is not actually a man. He is only partly a man, and therefore they can logic their way, they can lawyer their way around their vow of chastity, because a vow of chastity only applies to apparently intercourse with a man and not with a half man or not a man, or in this case, they refer to him as practically being a eunuch because he can neither speak nor hear. They think, at any rate, that he can neither speak nor hear. So that is a very interesting insight into, at the very least, the 14th century Italian idea about dumbness and deafness, about disability, other ability, however you wish to refer to it. But because the Decameron is massively popular across all of Europe, translations are made all across Europe: Spanish, French, German, English, as I said, very highly popular in the 15th century, especially, which is why it's appropriate for me to be reading this to you in my 15th century guise. That because it was popular, it must have been relatable, therefore, and this must have been an attitude that was not limited to Italy. It must have been more prevalent and more universal than that in medieval Europe. This idea that if you are deaf and or dumb, that you are not a complete human, that you are somehow only part of a person, not a complete man, and therefore it's okay if you have sex with that man because that doesn't violate your vow of chastity. Like that's a major plot driver in this whole thing, that base underlying fundamental concept. So yeah. I'm so glad we chose this book. uh, Question: the long manable. How did I get into this? I've been fascinated by how people lived in past eras, basically since I can remember, since I was 2 or 3. And for some reason, the 15th century really drew me in particularly. I've been doing medieval living history for 30 years. I've been reading about and studying history, medieval history specifically, but also ancient history, basically since I was 2 or 3, since I could start to look at pictures and books and I could read by the time I was 5. So, yeah, long time, my whole life, basically. My whole life, basically. A premeditated promiscuity, right? Fantastic, isn't it? How did the author get away with this? The Middle Ages is not a time of prudishness at all. Please understand that medieval society in Europe is very lusty. It is very lusty. There's a lot of sex happening all over the place between all kinds of people, married and unmarried. There is, infidelity. It is not a time of prudishness. It really isn't. So these kinds of stories are super common, super, super common. And Boccaccio and Dante both have no problem criticizing the church. You might have noticed there were quite a few snide jabs at the church as an institution here, right? We even talk about the hypocrisy of Christians who promise God 1,000 things a day and deliver not one of them, right? Yeah, it's a very interesting, very interesting. These are fictional stories. Yes, these are folk tales. These are basically medieval folk stories. They've been floating around for a long time. Boccaccio, it's unlikely that he invented any of these stories. What he did is he took folk tales that had been floating around for decades at least, maybe centuries in some cases, and he fleshed them out. He adds his own language, like Shakespeare. He takes common stories, he fleshes them out in his own manner. He adds his own allegory, his own irony, his own sense of humor. Boccaccio's got a great sense of humor. I hope you were all laughing. I know the language is a little strange, and especially for my non-native English speakers out there, it is early 17th century English, so it's early modern English, right? So there were some strange terms, and I probably should have given you like a vocabulary list so you'd understand some of the recurring terms, but basically, these are folktales, right? And there's so much snide snark that Boccaccio incorporates into these stories. It's fantastic. It really is. Sai bella. Oh, Salina. Ciao. um, I purport opium was influential in these texts. They did have poppy juice, but they didn't have morphine. That's not a thing. Heroin and morphine are not a thing. And they're not smoking opium at this point. Europe, that's not in Europe. They have poppy juice. That's the best. I think people are just, I think people are people. And if you don't socialize it out of us, we are a lusty bunch just by nature, literally by our biological drives. So, yeah. Okay. So, were there any questions as I was going through, any specific questions? Otherwise, I'm going to go back through and maybe address a couple of specific things, maybe, or yeah, any specific questions about Massetto of Lamporecchio? Some of the interesting things for me about are the fantasy history here. Right. While you think about your questions, I want to talk about the fantasy history element here. This is also one of the ways in which I find it very easy when I'm doing medieval living history and I'm in a mixed era encampment, mixed culture encampment. From a 15th century perspective, it's really simple. I just view everyone else as being exotic because we've got exoticism happening here, right? The setting is not far from Alexandria. That's Egypt, by the way. There's a monastery. Well, there could actually be Coptic monasteries in Alexandria. I don't know, but it's a convent, right? And there are virgins being kept there. And Boccaccio talks about the Soldan, Soldan, right? For Sultan. Love it. The Soldan of Babylon. Completely, I mean, just fantastic. Babylon. I mean, just that word to refer to any part of the Middle East. That's a fantastic, it's just great. That's lovely, fun fantasy language. Like this is fantasy, right? There's this monastery that is, is it Muslim? Is it Christian? We don't know, right? There's just so much left unstated here. So it's got this fantastic fantasy level to the story, right? Even the setting is pseudo historical, even in the 14th century. So that's just fun. And then you've got the idea of Maseto, who is a young Hebrew peasant of the country. Hebrew peasant, right? That's the word for Jewish, right? So the hero of our story is Jewish. Mind blown, right? And he's not a bad guy. He's not presented in any kind of criminal way. I mean, there's a little slyness about him pretending to be deaf and dumb to get a job here at this monastery. But I'm going to say that everyone mutually exploited everyone else in this story. There are no victims in this story. Let's be clear. There really aren't victims in this story. Yeah, so Alexandria is a city and Babylon is apparently the region that they think is around there. Like they think that in the 14th century, I'm trying to think, in the 14th century, that was Cairo fell under the a caliph, right? I think fell under a caliph. I don't remember which caliphate it was, but it's part of a caliphate. I'm pretty certain. And I don't think the Ottomans have yet taken it over in the 14th century. But that's just it. That's exactly it. Like, where is Babylon? They don't know. I mean, Babylon is definitely not really a thing at this point anymore. That's Iraq, technically, right? That's Mesopotamia. That's Babylon. So this just shows. This also illustrates. It highlights that just like today, medieval people didn't necessarily have a fine grasp of geography either. I mean, if you ever go and interview random Americans in the street and ask them where Delaware is to start with, let alone where Australia is or Finland, you're going to find that they don't know where it is either on average. So the same lack of appreciation of correct geography now applies in this time, and it's what makes these stories easy for people to buy into because they don't have a good grasp of geography, so it doesn't ruin it for them, right? Ignorance is bliss. Maybe some stodgy scholar at a university, a professor at a university, a lecturer at a university may have had a better grasp, of geography, and maybe that would have completely pulled him out of the immersion of the story. Babylon isn't near Alexandria. Babylon's all the way across the Red Sea, in Arabia, but probably not. There were Celtic mercenaries by 3rd century BC in Egypt. Yep, Celts are definitely making, yeah, long since. The Celts had already been immigrating, for several hundred years at that point, across Africa and not Africa, well, Northern Africa, Europe, right? There are Celts in Germany as well. Everyone thinks the Celts are Irish. They're not originally. They're a migratory people who some of them end up in Ireland anyway. Yeah. Let me see. Wait, okay, hold on a minute. Oh, missed some things. I was giggling so hard that I dropped my tablet. Hello, just got back from school, and actually my course is architecture. Very cool, Castle we had. I'm still reading about Mesopotamia, and even then there was such writing. Yep, exactly. You're absolutely right. Um, Cody, when you say any romantic years, could you be a little more specific? I'm not certain to what that is in reference. Yeah. So that's interesting that we've got this story that is framed to be not far from Alexandria. There's this monastery, but the story actually opens in Lamporecchio, which is somewhere in Italy, right? And you've got this Hebrew peasant, this Jewish peasant, who strikes out to in search of opportunity. And boy, does he find opportunity, right? So yeah, I think, I'm not certain if you all picked up at the end, but basically at the end he had repopulated the monastery single-handedly, and then, like a good absent father, left all his children behind at the monastery, all his daughters behind at the monastery. I guess children. I think he just says children. Yeah, left his children behind and returned to his homeland, rich and comfortable. Right, merrily took ease of his age. Does it say daughters? Let me see. No, it just says children, nursing of his children. But he had repopulated the monastery, basically. The Abbasid Caliphate. Thank you, handsome. Do you think the Marquis de Sade would have known about this author? Yes, absolutely. The Marquis de Sade absolutely read Boccaccio. Guarantee it, 100%. I guarantee he had read Boccaccio. Definitely, no question in my mind that he had read Boccaccio's Decameron. Yeah. Okay, so any other questions or comments about our story? I think I discussed all the things I really wanted to specifically discuss, sort of the bigger concepts of, you know, disability, disability in the Middle Ages, how of audiovisual impairment could have actually made you seem less of an actual person in the medieval mindset, and how that could open you up for some perks at the job at the monastery that maybe whole men wouldn't have had access to. So I don't know. Would a deaf and dumb man actually be disadvantaged at this monastery? I feel like the answer is no. He gets a whole lot more out of the deal, out of the bargain. Yeah. Right. Okay. Any further questions about Il Decamerone, third day, the first novel? Dick Smith, thank you. This is a kirtle. It is a 15th century gown. This is actually technically underwear. Really, I'm dressed in what I call noblewoman casual. I'm wearing my smock and my blue war kirtle and a collar, and that's all I'm dressed for today because here I am in my private chambers. We are reading stories together, as it were. Now, that is the premise of this setting. Okay, right. So, time check, battery check. Right. One final reading for the day, therefore. So, in contrast to this lusty body tale, and I'd like to focus on the briefly the difference between the word lusty now and lusty then. So, lusty in the early 17th century and even earlier didn't it didn't mean that you were suffering from a surfeit of certain hormones. It meant that you were energetic and virile and healthy, right? That's what lusty meant. So that's how you can have lusty young people. It doesn't mean that they're being led by their genitals. It just means that they're young and virile and healthy. So in contrast to that licentiousness in the monastery outside of Alexandria under the control of the admiral and answering to the Sultan of Babylon, we have a 15th century dance manual. So this, it's funny, it's continuing. So we've got a connection there too, Jewish. So our hero in this story, our protagonist, I think is maybe a better term, our protagonist, Masetto of Lamporecchio, he is Hebrew, according to Boccaccio. And here we have a dance manual written by a fellow Hebrew, except this was a real man, not a fictional man, Guglielmo da Pesaro. He was Jewish, and he eventually converted, and then his name became Giovanni Ambrosio. But at first, in the first part of his career as a professional dance master, he was he was Jewish. He was a member of the Jewish faith and of the Jewish community. But in Italy, and this is the 15th century, so he was born in the 1420s, I think. In Italy in the 15th century, there are actually a relatively large number of Jewish dance masters whose names we actually know. Interesting. So this seems to have been an occupation that was common for members of the Jewish community. And so he publishes, he's a student of another dance master who precedes him, kind of what we know is the first official dance master in European history, actually, in post-ancient European history, Domenico da Piacenza. He's a student of Domenico da Piacenza, and he eventually becomes a court dance master, and he puts together this manual of dance, which is his opus magnum, and it's his great work. And it's basically a resume to be hired as a court dance master in a variety of courts in northern Italy. So that's why he puts together this gorgeous, it's beautifully telegraphed, beautifully illuminated, at least on the frontispiece. You can see this is actually the frontispiece of the manuscript. Isn't that a gorgeous piece of illumination? Right? Three dancers standing elegantly in the green field, just like in the Decameron, right, for dancing, with an elegant harpist accompanying them. So he publishes this work, and it's titled De Practica seu arte tripuri, on the practice and art of dancing. And because this is the era we're getting into humanism, I don't necessarily ascribe to the idea of the Renaissance as any kind of real actual thing versus just the general forward march of history. But there certainly is an increase in humanism, in the focus of humanism from an education perspective, from a philosophical perspective in the 15th century, puts greater focus on science and arts, but especially the sciences. And so part of the purpose of this book, he's trying to create validity for dance as an art and a science because he wants to be hired to teach it. So he needs to create this idea, to build this idea that dance is an art and a science and therefore worthy of real study, not just casual participation, but real study. And for real study, you need a real teacher. So the first chapters of this book are useless for teaching you to dance. Absolutely useless. The first chapters of this book are aimed at the patron or the prospective patron, Leonello d'Este, for instance, the Duca Ferrara, right? Or some equivalent prince, capital P, and they're aimed at them to present the art of dance, Terpsichore's great art, as worthy of study and worthy of being hired to propagate as an official art and not just as some casual activity that lusty young people pursue for licentious purposes, right? And amongst these introductory chapters, he actually there's sometimes poems. There's a great poem in his, a very long poem. This one in particular is actually dedicated to Lord Galeazzo, Viscount and Count of Pavia, etc. Right. So this particular edition of De Practica was specifically aimed to get hired by Galeazzo, the Viscount and Count of Pavia, who is the son of the Sforza, right? So he wants to get hired at the Sforza court, ultimately, is what's happening here. So in contrast to all of this lustiness that we have here in the Decameron, we're going to have not lustiness here, but it's still mentioned. So first, I'm going to see if there are any final questions, and then we're going to do it's a very short text, much shorter than the last one. Much shorter text, and then we will discuss it after I do a read through. Okay. Can you explain the flag at top right? Are you talking about my background? This is your right? This is the heraldry of the French nobleman who commissioned this tapestry series. It's got a bend sinister with 3 crescents on it. Bend sinister on a, let me see, on a bend sinister azure, 3 crescents argent on a field gules. My blazoning isn't super great, but some blazoned something like that. So yeah, I forget the name of the family that actually commissioned this, the noble house that commissioned this, but that's their heraldry. And that's why it's kind of built everywhere into this. It's even worked into the lances on both sides, and it's pretty prevalent. It's part of a series of tapestries, La Dame à la Licorne, in the Musée de Cluny. I have reproductions of all of them, actually. Okay. I forget Netflix. This is better. Awesome. Thank you. How scandalous dancing. Yeah, it strikes me that I suffer to imagine a medieval Jew and their importance in literature. Interesting, Cody. So I wonder why that is. Well, it could be because medieval history is often taught, your medieval European history is often taught from a very from a very Christian-centric perspective, possibly. But also medieval history is just not taught well at all in America. I can't speak for the education system in the UK or in Europe about how much of medieval history they actually cover or teach. But yeah, Jews played a major part in European society, large parts of it. They were exiled from England in the 13th century, but before that, they were very prevalent in England as well, right? There are massive Jewish communities all over medieval Europe, thriving and functioning right alongside, Christian society. And then the Crusades start, and then they, instead of actually going on crusade, these asshole Christians get the idea that pogroms on Jews will be the same as get them into heaven as well. It gets ugly. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that right now because that is ugly, and frankly, the world is pretty ugly right now. Let us go back. Yeah, how scandalous dancing. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay, so this is the part of the moralization of dance, or how our good dance master Guglielmo feels that dance should be considered versus how it shouldn't be considered. He says, this art of dancing, oh, excuse me, I have to start a little further up in this. Wherefore I, most devoted disciple and fervent follower of that most praiseworthy knight, Master Domenico of Ferrara, most learned and outstanding in the aforesaid art of the dance, as can be gathered from his widely known and excellent doctrines. Although I find myself unequal to and of small wit for so lofty an undertaking, and prompted neither by insolence nor vainglory, nor yet by presumptuous intention, but simply by the amiable and gentle entreaties of some virtuous and upright youths, eager and willing to learn and master the perfection of the aforesaid art, and closely bound to me by honest friendship, I, being in no way able to deny their persuasive and honest entreaties, resolved, as far as my wits consented, that I had to in part satisfy their lofty and honest desire, by presenting, in the compilation of this small work of mine, on the virtue and art of dancing, some pertinent and essential elements which, once grasped and kept firmly in mind, with the addition of practice, will enable everyone to dance with ease and assurance, and most commendably on all festive occasions, and to exercise this skill in surpassing fashion. This art of dance most favors and befits those whose hearts are loving and generous, and whose spirits are ennobled by a heavenly bent rather than by fortuitous inclination. But it is completely alien to, and the mortal enemy of, vile and rude mechanicals, who often, with corrupt souls and treacherous minds, turn dance from a liberal art and virtuous science into something adulterous and ignoble. And often, in the guise of honor, they even make it pimp for their shameful lewdness, so that they may slyly use dancing to satisfy their lust. In such as these, in so far as I am able, I wholly deny my present work, and I wish in no way for it to fall into their hands, lest I become at any time the main cause and detriment of their iniquitous and wicked depravity. Therefore, I recommend this work to the honest and chaste of heart only, and to those who aspire to it, the dance as a virtue and as a proper science, and wish to devote themselves to it with humble and sincere affection. And I beg them to read it, graciously recognizing my good intentions, even if I have overlooked any little portion that may render it less than perfect, and ever submitting myself to the valuable criticism of my honored and learned master, and to whomever else is highly skilled and expert in the said art. Therefore, pay heed, and with blithe spirit consider well its various parts, thereby dancing happily and virtuously. Right. Okay. So we've got some fun things here. Yeah, okay. So first let me go back to the comments here. In the Caribbean, medieval history is almost non-existing. Yeah, I would guess so. In America, it's almost non-existent as well. So in the UK, mainly the Tudors that's taught. Yeah, it frustrates me. BBC frustrates me because their obsession with the Tudors is enraging, maddening. There's so much wonderful history that predates the Tudors. I mean, it's the Tudors, honestly, it gets dark and depressing for me at the time of the Tudors. What did people use as perfume? Oh, a lot of different things. Depends on your period. By the 15th century, we've got oils, scented oils, musk, different glands from different animals were used as perfume. Sweet smelling herbs, still distilled or soaked in oil, cloves, cinnamon, sweet spices, not herbs, sorry, spices. Yeah, lots of spices. Medieval perfume in Europe is very spicy. Like we would recognize it as almost being, you might think it was pumpkin spice, actually. Is this the equivalent of getting a good recommendation from your professor? The opening sounds like it. Yeah. The tapestry and the collar are so beautiful. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. I carefully curated my tapestry collection. And this collar, this is a replica of Maria Portinari's collar by Armor and Castings. You can check their website out for more amazing medieval replica jewelry. Contessa 10 gets you 10% off any order. Yeah. Oh yeah, Cosmetica Obscura. Thank you, my condottiere, for if you're interested in sweet smelling oils of a natural and medieval type or even ancient type, cosmeticaobscura.com has an amazing array of all natural skincare products and also cosmetics based on medieval or ancient recipes and Renaissance recipes that are also not going to poison you or, add heavy metals to your blood. Yeah. Mighty Python might be influential, of European origin for medieval history. Yeah, yeah, I would say that for many people, Monty Python is their only exposure to medieval history. Isn't that sad? Yeah, so this is definitely this opening is very interesting because it makes in telling us that dance should only be for the virtuous, that dance should only be for those who are honest and chaste and pure and generous of heart, right? In telling us all of that, in having to specify it so very clearly and multiple times, what that tells me is that for certain, in 15th century Italy, at the very least, many people are engaging in dance not for virtuous purposes. They are not engaging in dance to be chaste. They are engaging in dance for the so-called licentious and lewd purposes, because otherwise there would be no need for this man to protest so much. I just love the mortal enemy of this dance is completely alien to, and the mortal enemy of vile and rude mechanicals. Now, some of you may have stumbled upon that word mechanicals before in another history/literary context, Shakespeare. Does anyone remember the mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream? Now, maybe when you read A Midsummer Night's Dream the first time, or maybe you've seen the play, you wondered about the term mechanicals. Well, that's because that is a historical English word for base people, for people who are base, who are common. Not commoners, like not royal blood, I mean common. So that's why it's referred to as that's why they are referred to, Bottom the joiner, etc., are referred to as the mechanicals, because they're considered on the lowest tier of society. Yeah. So, oh yes, Haley, I have like 90 plus massive tapestries, very large tapestries, replicas, mostly 15th century, one 16th century and one 14th century replica. Yeah, I've got a massive collection of tapestries. I have enough tapestries to literally wallpaper my home, a decent sized house in tapestries on purpose. Yeah. Let me see. Yep. Okay, so here we have these mechanicals. They should not dance, right? They have corrupt souls and treacherous minds. And they're going to turn this liberal art and virtuous science of dance into something adulterous and ignoble, right? But that's the reality, is that if you actually look at the dances that are contained in this manual and reconstruct them, as I've reconstructed many of the dances in this manual. There are videos on my YouTube channel with tutorials on many of the dances in this manual if you're interested. If you actually look at these dances and you pay attention to the geography and the way people are interacting, these dances are meant for flirtation. They are designed for interaction. And in fact, one of the instructions later on in this manual tells ladies not to stare at their floor, but to make modest eye contact with their partner. And it's like, come on, what do you think that eye contact is going to lead to? Really? Really? Yeah. Oh, Alexander, are you wanting to be banned? Is that what you're aiming for? You can, if you trying to slander my Karen friends, my friends with the name of Karen. Okay, so are there questions about our dance manual, about the fine art of dance and its virtuous pronunciation and practice? Yeah, exactly, Susan. Mechanicals are the lower members of society. Okay, if there are no questions, then I'm just going to finish up today with a reading of one of the dances described in this manual. This is a dance that is actually rather popular in various medieval living history groups. The SCA in particular has danced a lot at the event called Penzic. The dance is called Anello, which means ring in Italian. And in Guglielmo's work, it's attributed to Domenico da Piacenza, his master, as he refers to them. Oh, mechanical equals Karen. Oh, I see. No, mechanicals are any male, female. Mechanicals are just the lower members of society, basically. I see, Alexander. I see. Okay, it's all good. It's all good. For me, the Spanish flamenco dance is exotic. How did it come to be? Its origins. Oh, the flamenco is interesting. So the flamenco, there's some theories about the flamenco, right? So first off, the flamenco costume, like you understand the traditional, the traje, flamenco, the traje of flamenco dancers, not at all historical. Don't even, not even the tiniest bit, not even the tiniest bit, not medieval at all. I mean, not historical in the sense of it's not medieval, right? It's obviously historical in the sense it does come from some period of history, but recent. So flamenco is actually comes from the word for someone. Flamenco actually means weirdly Flemish. It's the Spanish word for someone from Flanders. But they think that the flamenco is a dance that, one of the theories that I read anyway, is that it's a dance that evolved from the combination of Moorish and also um, traveler Roma members of Roma society who came and settled in Spain. There's some theories. There's different theories about that. Whether it's a dance that evolved out of a style of Moorish dancing that had evolved over time on the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually, even though the Moors left, it stuck around and continued to evolve, or that it was introduced by the Roma populations, the Gitano populations of Spain. God, I hope I don't get banned for using that word. Um, yeah, so there's some theories about flamenco, but I have no evidence of the flamenco as we see it today existing in medieval Spain or Renaissance Spain either. So that doesn't mean it didn't in some form, but I just haven't seen I haven't found the evidence of it. Yeah. There is a dance in Interestingly, there is a dance from second half of 16th century Italy called the Canary, Il Canario. It's presented in an Italian manual, but it is attributed as being a dance from the peoples of the Canary Islands, except by the 16th century, the native peoples of the Canary Islands were basically no more. They'd either died off or been bred out by the Spanish settlers. And so it could actually be the Italians thinking that this dance is from the Canary Islands and that's some kind of, you know, fantastical origin story, but it's actually from Spain. So the canary actually has a lot in common. The footwork of the canary is just footwork. The canary is only footwork, no hands. A lot in common with flamenco footwork. So there's a couple of theories, but I haven't heard anything really solid or truly ultimately convincing. Yeah, so it's exactly this, and these are theories, and it's, there's it's very interesting. Yeah, and it's especially it because of the way the guitar is played and the sound of flamenco music, and right. But if you listen to, the Portuguese have an equivalent. um Shoot, faldo. Damn it, the word went out of my head. I've got Spanish stuck in my head. They have an equivalent in Portugal as well. And so the fact that you've got these equivalents really does tell me that at least the song, I feel like the song, especially because the style of singing, flamenco singing, is so reminiscent of traditional Arab, Northern African and Arab vocalization, right? That it just screams like those, that could actually be true. That could actually be true. Yeah. Yeah, let me see. How did the literature go from Decameron to being virtuous in all things? Yeah, exactly. I wanted to I know. So we had our down and dirty Decameron reading and then our super virtue. I purposely wanted to juxtapose those two so that you can understand that even though there were people who are getting a little hoity-toity about their virtue, the reality of society is lusty. Right? You can have a manual that talks about virtue and modesty all at once, but if you actually read tales about real people, you realize that the reality of lived life is not the same as the goals, the aspirations of these kinds of treatises. Right? I purposely wanted to contrast those two. Wednesday Adams, I mean, I love Wednesday, so I would take it. Fado, thank you, not Fado. Fado. Yes, 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 Fado. Yep. Yep. Okay. So I just want you to get the reason I want to read these dance instructions to you. Not that you're going to reconstruct the dance from it, you're not. But I want you to understand how hard it is for us who are trying to recreate medieval dances. how challenging it can be to take words that have no frame of reference, really, because none of us have witnessed these dances. None of us are alive who did. And there's no videos from the 15th century. And there's no illustrations that come with these particular dances. 16th century dance manuals have copious illustrations, not in the 15th century. Therefore, it is very challenging for us to actually reconstruct these dances. And so I'm going to read to you this. It's not long, it's a paragraph. It's real quick. But I want you to try to appreciate how challenging it must therefore be to actually take these words and turn them into a real concrete dance. Okay, so this dance is called Anello, created by Messer Domenico. First, do 8 measures of saltarello, beginning with the left foot and finishing with the right. At the last measure, that is, having done 7, the men drop ladies' hands and all 4 finish in a square. That is, the men facing one another, and the ladies do the same, and all stop. Next, the men do a movimento, and the ladies reply, and the men change places with 2 measures of saltarello, beginning with the left foot and making a mezza volta on the right side to face one another. Then finish in a square. Next, the ladies do a movimento, and the men reply. And then they change places in the same way as the men did, and also finish in a square. And then all do a movimento together. Next, the men make a mezza volta, next, the men make a volta tonda, turning to the left side. Then the ladies do the same and stop. Next, the men set off and go behind their partners with 4 tempi of piva, starting with the left foot and ending with the right, changing places and finishing in a square again. Then the ladies do the same, both finishing in their places. Next, the men do a movimento and the ladies reply, and this is done twice. The end. Right. Okay, so that is a set of instructions for one whole dance called Anello. So this dance dates to roughly 1450. And thankfully, this dance actually came with music. The music was provided for this. So at least we have an idea of the music and the structure of the music, which can help us inform this dance Anello. But there are so many gaps in the information, so many things taken for granted. For instance, how do they face each other? It just says that they finish in a square. That is the men facing one another, and the ladies do the same. It doesn't say how they go from facing the way they are before that to the way they are after that. It doesn't even say how they are at the beginning of the set. It doesn't even say how the 4 people are arranged. It just says a ballo, a dance for 4. And it literally starts off with, first they do 8 measures of saltarelli. It doesn't say if they're holding hands. It doesn't say how these 4 people are arranged. It doesn't even say if they're dancing together, except that a couple of, a sentence later, it finally says the men drop the ladies' hands. Okay, so that means at some point the men and the ladies are holding hands. It says that they finish in a square, but it doesn't say how they are before that, right? So there are so many gaps, so much assumed knowledge. This was clearly aimed at someone who already had a base idea of the dance. And the idea is that if you hire me, I can teach your courtiers these kinds of dances, right? So you don't want to see me recreating any dancing. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, there's just so many holes. Now, if you want to see me actually working through a much more complicated dance than this, reconstructing it, on my YouTube channel, I have the first 2 parts of a dance called tessera, that beautiful weaving dance that some of you have seen me do with 10 people with streamers and imitating the weaving of brocade, right? If you go to my YouTube channel, I have 2 videos on recreating, I think I call it resurrecting a dead dance, right? Recreating a dance from the past. You can actually see me walk through the process and actually see literally in terms of the dancers demonstrate all of my artistic choices and explain why I chose the reconstructions I chose. So if you want to delve more into recreating a 15th century dance, I do have 2 videos on for the first parts of a dance called tessera on my YouTube channel. Okay, are there any questions for anyone? So while you're coming up with final questions, I'm just going to recap through we just have to end before 3 hours for reasons. We're at 2 minutes and 53 seconds. So you have 4 more minutes to come up to ask and for me to answer your questions. So this was Guglielmo Ebreo of Pesaro de Pratica seu arte tripudi, right? And then before that, we read from John Florio's translation of Il Decamerone. And then before that, we read a couple of excerpts, food related, from The Plantagenet Age, Everyone a Witness. I will, of course, as always, I will take pictures of the covers and the ISBNs, and I will post them on Facebook, Instagram, and the community wall, a community post on my YouTube channel, and of course in my Patreon and in the Discord, in Book Corner Discord. Okay. Again, I would like to thank my patrons and my channel members and my super chatters who have left really generous tips. You've generously financially supported my work, enabling me to keep bringing this to a bigger community worldwide. I thank all of you who are part of my court, part of my community, as I'm calling it, who participate in these live chats, who ask questions, leave good comments, share your own knowledge and experience, who comment in the videos once they posted or on my older recorded videos, who hit the thumbs up, who are just generally coming along with me on this crazy adventure. I would like to thank you all. Got some big news. I'm going on a 2-week Mediterranean voyage. I'm going to be heading from Barcelona to Istanbul and to Turkey and Greece. And we will be doing some living history travel while we're there. I'll be doing a live stream in 15th century attire tour of the Cartel Gótico in Barcelona. Right, so I'll be in full Burgundian finery. I'm going to be doing Istanbul in one of my very earliest things that I made, which was an 18th century Turkish noblewoman's outfit. I'll be wearing that for our tour around Topkapi Palace. We'll be live streaming that if possible. If not, we'll record it and post it. So we'll have some fun living history adventures, not all medieval, going to be from different periods. There's going to be a lot of ancient history because of the various places we're actually going to on our voyage. But if you're interested in following me on my travels, then please do check out my Travels with the Creative Contessa channel. I'd love to learn about the musicians as well. Thank you for awesome content. Thank you, Kyle. I just did a whole series of posts on medieval balls. If you check on my I think Facebook, actually. Let's see. Do all the dances have music included? No, that's a great question, Stanislav. No, they do not. Many of the dances do not have music included because my theory is the ones that don't have music included were probably popular tunes. So there was a pop song that existed. They composed a dance to fit to the music, to the popular tune. Why would you waste parchment on something so common as a pop tune? I have actually found some of these popular songs and we have lined them up with the dance. So no, sadly, not all the music is included. Oh, thank you, Cody, for joining us today. Really appreciate you as always. What instruments were used oh goodness. So at this era, we have shawms, bagpipes, harps, lutes, various kinds of strung instruments, rebec, viol, gambas. We have pipes, we have tabors, harps. Did I already say harps? Wide variety of instruments, really wide variety of instruments in this era. Yeah, great questions, everyone. Okay, what time am I usually on? Good question. Usually East Coast Americas, East Coast US, Americas usually 9 or 10 p.m. And then Asia, then because I'm actually in Korea right now, usually 8 and 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. But there are some various times. But I've got live streams scheduled all this week. So join me for more live streaming fun, for different kinds of live streaming upcoming, more collaborations with Philip from Irish Medieval History included. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing the Medieval Buzz with Philip. So we'll be talking about medieval news. The morning after that, the day after that, we'll be live streaming me playing through Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the new release, downloadable content release. I will be snarkily critiquing whatever I don't like that I see there. And then we're going to be discussing, meeting up with an historian and discussing the idea of Irish clans in the Middle Ages. And I'm going to be comparing and contrasting that with the idea of familia in medieval Italy. So we've got some fun planned for you this week. Otherwise, everyone, I'd like to thank you all And I look forward to seeing you in future live streams. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, wherever